All right, y'all. We are going to go ahead and get rocking and rolling. It looks like we have a majority of outpatient folks here with us today. We've got some Check and Connect, TSS, MTBSC, a few SBOs, and some family-based, but we're mostly outpatient here today. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind, or in the sake of full disclosure. The snacks are whatever's in your house today, so good luck, you're on your own. We will take breaks throughout, but I also believe that we are all adults, and so you may get up and go to the bathroom whenever the nature calls to you. We will also take some breaks throughout today because I can't realistically speak for continuous hours and expect any sort of functioning pattern of language to come out of my mouth. You don't need to sign out today because Devin will be hopping on here probably in a minute or two to check that everyone's here, and then she hops on at the end to confirm that everyone is still here. So please try to have your cameras on because she does use your beautiful glowing faces to allow her to confirm that. And please don't hesitate to ask a question. You can either use the raise your hand feature on the participant button or just unmute yourself and ask the question. I try to monitor the group chat to see if a question comes through from that avenue, but sometimes it's really difficult to do, especially if I have too many screens open at once. Usually the group chat is the first to go for me from my end. So if you have a question, please don't hesitate to just unmute yourself and ask a question. So for the most part, everyone here, or about half of everyone here, is a outpatient therapist, and then a sprinkling of other things. And I like to begin with a very clear professional disclosure. So today's training is about medical marijuana for the treatment of mental health disorders. And I'm going to say that one more time. Today's training is about medical marijuana for the treatment of mental health disorders. And primarily, we're going to be discussing the startling lack of evidence to support their use. There is oodles upon oodles of evidence to support its use for things like pain management or as palliative care, or for treatment of individuals sort of navigating a cancer diagnosis. That's not what we're talking about today. So we will probably get into a time, and there's occasionally at this particular training where individuals really want to discuss the benefits of marijuana for some of those other more medically based diagnoses. And we'll get into the details of some of that a little bit. But there truly is significant evidence to support its use. So I want to make it very clear, I'm not anti-marijuana. I'm not anti-cannabis in any way. I very much see it as a part of the criminal justice reform that's really necessary here in the state of Pennsylvania and as and in the United States as a bigger picture. I am talking about it from the when it comes to the medical evidence that presently exists. So I'm not anti-cannabis. I am pro-science. And every time on my evaluation, someone operates from the assumption that I'm coming to this with some sort of bias, and it's certainly not that way at all. My goal is just to make sure that we're operating within sort of the clinical best practices for medical marijuana. So before we get going, let's see in the news how we are treating marijuana.
I feel a sense of accomplishment because I built a house. This house has brought us financial independence.
This house changed our lives.
Habitat for Humanity is at work in your community and around the world. Through shelter, we empower.
I think that's the concern in the room is why here?
The Allison Hill community made its opinions clear Wednesday night as local dispensaries presented plans for its proposed medical marijuana facility.
I think it might bring more crime because due to the fact that the crime level right in this little area already is sort of high.
We're not going to benefit from it. I'm sorry.
The business is slated to become Harrisburg's second medical marijuana dispensary, and it says it would help revitalize the 17th Street corridor. The founder shared the site plans during a community forum at the Hamilton Health Center, and the center's CEO says she's reluctant to say she supports the proposal.
I know that it's going to create a lot of contention in the community for people who may want the drug, can't afford it, and we can't have anything to do with it.
Residents hope more forums like this one will be held in the near future, but the founders, who are not from the Harrisburg area, have not yet said when another will happen.
This community is one that's going to keep them accountable.
So that was very recent in the general Harrisburg area, right down the street from one of our clinics. This particular project, sorry, my Zoom is now logging me out. This particular project, I believe has had the green light and then ran into some zoning issues. So I'm not quite sure where that is at in terms of progress. I'm sure COVID-19 slowed things down a bit as well. You all have been given a list of terms that came out with your reminder email. And that is a list of all different kinds of marijuana terminology, and recognizing that it's probably not comprehensive. Our language for different street drugs, as well as all different kinds of substances, has a tendency to shift and change pretty regularly, but I wanted to give you some sort of tool or glossary to be able to reference should it be necessary. But there are a few points of language that I do really want to make sure that we're sort of when we're talking on the same page or from the same type of understanding. So the very first thing that we're going to discuss is CBD oil. CBD has gained a lot of popularity here in the United States within the last 10 years. It's a very popular, very common, and it touts the ability to treat anything from sleeplessness to inflammation to pain. There is very little empirical research to test any of these hypotheses, and much of it is not regulated by the FDA, so there are no clinical trials or support for their claims. It is also being produced with very little oversight, so to some degree that could be quite dangerous because it is not being monitored. And essentially it is an extract from the buds of marijuana or the hemp plant. It does not have THC, or if it does, it has very, very low levels of THC, and it does not create that euphoric or sort of high experience for its users. Research does support the use of CBD for epilepsy, but that is really the only substance that is the only real medical trial that it's passed. So when it comes to sleeplessness, pain management, inflammation, anxiety, all of the other claims that CBD oil makes, there is no empirical evidence to support its use, with the exception of epilepsy. However, one of the things that individuals are really challenged to keep in mind is that some of the studies have shown more long-term or dangerous effects of CBD use. So it's really been touted as this very safe drug. I know that people give it to children and dogs and all kinds of different things. But one of the things that the research is showing is that it probably necessitates additional research, because what we know is that it can cause some liver damage with long-term use, and that we're not quite sure about all of the effects if used over an extended period of time. So to make sure everybody's safe, probably additional research in this area could be helpful. We're also going to talk today about THC, which is what creates that high or euphoric effect in different marijuana products. It has a tendency to make us feel hungry, as well as relieve certain symptoms like pain or nausea. In areas in which marijuana has been utilized for pain management, we are seeing lower overall addictive rates and overdose rates when it comes to opiates, because marijuana has been used in lieu of opiate pain medication. So again, I want to emphasize that I think that medical cannabis clearly has a place in our society and within our field, but only for empirically validated uses. So how do you decide? And one of the things we know is that here in the state of Pennsylvania, the laws that are that regulate require individuals who work at medical marijuana dispensaries to maintain active licenses, active pharmacist licenses. However, in many of our pharmacist training programs, they might receive very minimal training in this particular area. And in order to work at a dispensary, they do a 4-hour online training to allow them for that type of licensing. In addition, when an individual is given medical marijuana, they are not prescribed medical marijuana. They are given a medical marijuana card that certifies them for its use. So when it comes to sort of the prescriptive nature that we're so used to when it comes to medications, typically those prescriptions have things like dosing information, milligrams, frequency. That's not true in the world of medical marijuana. In medical marijuana, they're given their certification. And so when an individual receives their certification, and we'll talk about that process a little later on today, when an individual receives that certification, they take their card with them to the dispensary, and they're not allowed to take anybody in with them. So only the individual with the card is allowed to go in. They then discuss with the pharmacist, or they're sort of left to their own devices to figure it out. I've heard conflicting reports. So I know one individual that I've known for quite some time received a medical marijuana card in the course of navigating cancer. She said, I don't know anything about marijuana. So she went into the dispensary and said, I would like one that won't make me feel as high, but I would like something for pain and sleep. So as she went in and they said, oh, well, you want this one. And it was like 10% or like a 10 THC, 3 CBD. So they have the different ratios of CBD versus THC dominant strains. And she said, I came home, I was high out of my mind. I ate my whole pantry. I didn't know anything about anything. And then after she started researching, she realized she wanted a more CBD dominant strain. And then there are strains that sort of balance the two. But those with CBD have a tendency to allow for individuals to be a bit more clear-headed in their use. So when you look at CBD versus THC, this is just sort of a general breakdown of the different symptomology. I think the things that are really important to keep in mind is that CBD is considered legal in the United States, and you can buy CBD oil at Sheetz and Target and anywhere else. Order it online, get it shipped to you from Amazon, and has almost no psychoactive effects. Although we are seeing some evidence to suggest that it can require some individuals who use CBD oil are testing positive for marijuana, which is curious because the marijuana urine test for THC. So I do find that interesting, or an interesting period of overlap. From a cannabis advocacy website, these are the things that they're suggesting CBD is good for. Although, again, I really want to emphasize that there's not a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles suggesting its support. So it's quite controversial still. Now, this is from a peer-reviewed article in which they found that THC and CBD very specifically is a very strong anticonvulsant. Also looking at different muscular and even antipsychotic at times. And then also looking at other types of side effects, which with THC can include sedation, tachycardia, and hypertension. So all of that's important to keep in mind, that if you have a client with sort of concurrent cardiovascular or heart disease, that any sort of medical marijuana may exacerbate those symptoms. So marijuana over the years, what we've noticed is that they have literally been working on marijuana as if it's the cure for cancer. And so back in even the early to mid 90s, the levels of THC within the average concentration of cannabis was significantly lower. And that level of THC has increased pretty dramatically over the last several years, now being about 3 times that which was initially present. What that means is that individuals are requiring smaller and smaller doses to have a higher and higher effect. We can't discuss the impact without discussing that marijuana is so diverse in its in its composition. So as a plant, marijuana is composed of more than 500 different chemical substances, and only a small fraction of these substances have been studied in an empirically validated way. Federally, marijuana is still considered a Schedule 1 or Class 1 narcotic. So it's still qualified in the same way that heroin or crack cocaine is. For many reasons, that's created a number of barriers when it comes to its study, because researchers who receive federal funding are unable to research the effects of marijuana. Now, recently, legislation has been introduced to the House, which it did pass through the House, and I think it needs to be revised or reviewed within the Senate. But that legislation is designed to reduce the classification and decriminalize, and I think the legislation even indicates to go as far as to legalize marijuana, but at the very least decriminalize it. I think that a lot of us are very closely watching this particular legislation, because it would do a tremendous thing when it comes to its impact on our criminal justice system, and perhaps changing some of the disparity within our criminal justice system. So I remain hopefully optimistic, or cautiously optimistic, that that will also reduce some of our prison overcrowding when it comes to individuals with that are incarcerated for small possession of marijuana, things like that. Many individual states and cities have gone as far as to decriminalize marijuana within a certain percentage. And then, of course, we have many states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use. It is generally understood that the psychotropic substance within marijuana that's primarily responsible for its intoxicating effects is THC. So there are different blends of marijuana. I am at least 21, thank you. Hold on. Get this video. I need to switch screens for you all. Sorry. I don't love cannabis. Thank you. Why do I have no sound?
Related the effects they feel from cannabis to a strain's classification, whether it's indica, sativa, or hybrid. We are learning that the effects you feel from cannabis are less about the morphology of the plant and instead more about a plant's terpene and cannabinoid profile and how they react with your body. So to put this theory to a test, we've gathered 3 cannabis consumers of various experiences and preferences, giving them all the same cannabis strain, but didn't tell them what it is. We'll ask them to guess if what they smoked is a sativa or an indica. If how we've been thinking about cannabis up until this point holds up, they should all guess the same thing, right? Right.
I feel like indica strains work best for me. Calming, killer high, more body high. When I smoke sativas, it gives me a little bit of anxiety, palm sweaty, palm spaghetti, you know what I mean?
I'm like a sativa type. I feel like I don't want to be too laid down. I want to still be able to smoke it and go on about my day. For me, I always thought sativa, specifically because I don't need help relaxing or falling asleep. So whenever I want to smoke, it's because it's in the day when I want to be doing stuff. Don't threaten me with a good time. good. I feel real calm, real chill.
Definitely got a crazy, incredible head high from this. Feeling pretty chill, hands somewhat sweaty.
I feel high. I kind of feel like high in public high rather than just totally comfortable high, I guess.
It's weird the palms are sweaty though, so I guess just go with it, and I'm gonna guess sativa.
If I had to pick, which I guess I do, I don't really feel like cleaning my house right now, so I would say indica.
I am leaning towards indica just by how, like, I felt like melting into the couch over there. But my head's real clear, so this is tricky. But I'm going to say indica.
Are you ready to find out what it is? The answer is sativa. Yeah, lemon G. So as you can see, there's a lot more to the effects we feel from cannabis than just indica or sativa. There's phenotype, terpene profile, cannabinoid profile, and so much more. So when it comes to choosing which strain and product might be right for you, it's time for us to start thinking about things just a little bit different.
Give your cannabis a coarse grind. If you don't have a grinder, get creative with scissors.
So as you can see, one of the things that we're starting to recognize, and likely when research becomes a little bit more widely spread, there's a lot of discussion about indicas versus sativas versus this versus that, and obviously they also discussed all the different chemical properties within that. Unfortunately, I don't know that we really understand all of the different pieces yet. Now, what we do know is that there is some research to support the use of medical marijuana in terms of MS, specifically when it came to the areas of reducing painful spasms and reducing pain, which is pretty consistent with our knowledge and our belief about THC at this point. It did not help in any way when it came to levels of bladder dysfunction. Sorry, someone's stuck in a waiting room. So it didn't help at all when it came to bladder dysfunction. Centrally medicated pain and pain spasms, it was beneficial. When it comes to neurodegenerative diseases or disorders, there has been no reliable conclusions in terms of Huntington's disease. When it comes to Parkinson's, there's been one single study, but so far CBD is shown to be generally ineffective at treating any kind of dyskinesia and Parkinson's related diseases. I've also seen a number of claims that marijuana is an effective treatment for Alzheimer's. However, that has not been replicated in any peer-reviewed research. So while the claims are out there and you will see memes on the internet, there does not appear to be any true scientific or medical evidence for this. They also did some research when it comes to other neurological disorders, such as Tourette's syndrome. The available data was determined to be insufficient to allow for any kind of reliable conclusions. And last but not least, cervical dystonia. Insufficient data was found in this particular area as well. So obviously, we need a lot more research in the area of cannabis. Should it be no longer classified as a Schedule I narcotic, I think that will open up the doors to allowing additional research in this area. There is lots and lots and lots and lots of evidence to support its use for cancer or pain. And so those are just some studies that support its use, even as far as its use for migraine headaches. However, one of the downsides can also be migraine headaches. So just like any of the other black box labels, like on antidepressants, their warnings include depression and suicide. Anti-anxieties, their warnings include anxiety. So I think it's really important to recognize that while it can be an effective treatment for some, it's not going to be an effective treatment for others, and to discuss some of those downsides with our clients. I want to take a minute and we can all sit with the discomfort that there really isn't much good research. I did this training initially back in October, and in re-preparing for it this week, not much has changed in terms of the literature. So I thought I could do a new literature review. I would at least get like 3 or 4 new studies, right? No, nothing new in about 9 months. So we just kind of have to sit with not knowing. And I'm going to review the research that we have. What is concerning is the claims that are being made by the medical marijuana industry. And specifically by medical marijuana advocates or legislators, is that a lot of claims are being made with very, very, very little empirical evidence. So I'm going to say it one more time for those in the back. While I am not anti-marijuana, I am very much pro-research. And I've sort of reached that personal conclusion. So here's my soapbox with my personal conclusion, is that I would much rather see marijuana legalized for recreational use, and we stop with all of the false medical claims, rather than to continue to have marijuana advocates go down the line of medical claims. There's a lot of contradicting studies in this particular area, and individual differences in sort of objective and subjective effects are significantly variable, which can be true for a lot of medications for mental health disorders. However, the research in this particular area is not super positive in terms of medical marijuana for mental health disorders. So right now, some of the problems that we have is efficacy and safety of these medications are pretty highly in question, extremely small sample sizes, and for the most part, the samples are individuals that it's not well controlled. So the sample is individuals that were not, not well controlled, and individuals that weren't sort of random assignment, but folks that just chose to smoke marijuana sort of outside, like it was not a randomly controlled study. Many of the studies are very, very, very alarmingly short term. So especially the ones where it comes to medical marijuana for opiate addiction, where I have my biggest personal bias, is a few days to a few weeks, and nothing beyond that. So as we know, when it comes to the treatment of an opiate use disorder, that's a marathon, not a sprint. And the medical marijuana studies in those particular areas, literally 2 to 3 weeks. No follow-up assessments and no long-term data. So I think it's really important that we have some nuance in our discussions, that we recognize that even though something might not necessarily be helpful, the research also doesn't always suggest that it is harmful. However, there's times when it does. And it's extremely important for us to have these conversations with our clients because unfortunately, medical marijuana for mental health disorders is legal in the state of Pennsylvania, for example, for anxiety. And we're going to dig into that a little bit. But what a lot of the research is currently suggesting is that not only does medical marijuana not treat anxiety very well in the short term, it does appear to have some pretty negative long-term and potentially even lasting effects in the terms of anxiety. So these are all things that we really need to be able to discuss and have adult review of the literature, and just sort of everybody needs to be leaning in and exploring the different things there. So in case you're not getting it, these are exact quotes from all of the different studies that I read. So findings indicate that for the majority of these conditions, there is insufficient evidence to support the recommendation of medical marijuana at this time. Evidence for efficacy and safety of cannabis-based medications as a treatment for mental disorders is still very small. Long-term data are essential to get information for an optimal treatment duration, sustained effects, and safety. These results raise concerns for providers who are authorizing or counseling patients to consider medical cannabis, and given the extensive literature speaking to the harms associated with medical marijuana, research on the comparative safety, tolerability, efficacy, and risk of marijuana compared to existing pharmacological agents is needed. So all of that to say, even the research that does exist qualifies in their discussion sections like, we still don't really know much. And yet large and broad overarching claims are being made.
It reminds me a lot of the state of the alcohol literature, because there's a lot of literature on alcohol, possibly because it is legal, but it's almost a similar effect. Like, people think that when they drink, like, oh, they get more outgoing, it's a social lubricant, when the data says that social cognition actually plummets for most people. Like, emotional recognition, empathy really kind of goes out the window. And there's also almost a placebo effect, which is what that video reminded me of, where they've given people non-alcoholic beer and told them that it was alcohol, and then asked them to rate a bunch of things, and they're expecting that similar outcome because they know how they feel when they drink, but there's actually no actual alcohol in it. And it seems very similar, and perhaps it's because it's legal that there is so much more research on alcohol compared to marijuana.
And I'm hoping, I mean, again, if they end up passing that literature, I think we have it'll be, if they end up passing that, like the decriminalization, but even right now, like for those of you at 17th Street, that dispensary right down the street is right across, or will be right across from Hamilton Health. And Hamilton Health is a federally qualified healthcare center where they can't have anything to do with it. And if they get caught even recommending that a client goes next door, all of their federal funding could get pulled. We at PCS are in the very same boat. We sign off and say that we do not I mean, I don't recommend medical marijuana, and that we're going to get into that as we go through, for mental health disorders, because there's no evidence to support it. But we have to, as an agency that also accepts federal funding, sign off and say that we don't recommend it to our clients, because it could jeopardize our funding. So I have some serious concerns about medical marijuana, specifically if you look back, an excellent book, if you ever are looking, I mean, what else are you doing right now, right? You probably need some book recommendations. An excellent book is called Dreamland, and it's all about the history of the opioid epidemic here in America. And it looks back, like, heroin was initially developed to get people off of morphine. And it turned out it was extremely effective. How many morphine addicts do you know now? Very, very few. So heroin was developed as a treatment for morphine. As many of you probably have worked with clients that were once upon a time addicted to heroin, now they might be abusing Suboxone in many ways. So Suboxone was developed to get people off of heroin. It's not quite as enticing as heroin, but I've worked with plenty of clients that were abusing their Suboxone, or taking too much of it, or holding it for 3 days, not taking it for 3 days straight, and then taking all of it in an effort to obtain those euphoric effects. Last but not least, Purdue Pharma. I'm sure y'all have been watching that. Purdue Pharma, I think most recently in the last couple of weeks, has filed bankruptcy. They were the initial makers of OxyContin, and they made a whole bunch of money for the prescription of OxyContin, and the indication of the pain is the fifth vital sign, or whatever it is. And today's heroin problem is very much sort of tied back to that experience. So I think it's really important that we're starting to look at our prescriptive behaviors and its impact. I've worked with a lot of clients that have been prescribed benzodiazepines for anxiety, and seen long-term impact of those benzodiazepines and abusing of that prescription. So I am now going to take a minute and send everybody into, no, not yet, send everybody into breakout rooms, if I can get, there it is. And I would like everybody for about 10 minutes to discuss your own sort of preconceived notions or beliefs or perceptions about what we've talked about so far. So the notion of CBD oil and how you can sort of grab it at Cheats whenever you want, or people give it to their dog. I know I tried. I have a dog with hip dysplasia. I tried to give her CBD. It didn't do anything, and it was quite expensive. But, you know, you love your dog. I'm willing to try anything. Sort of discussing so far when it comes to the pop culture exploration of marijuana for mental health disorders or medical marijuana. So I'm going to send everybody into some breakout rooms. I don't want 11 rooms. We're going to try 10. And I will be popping around to join you all for a few minutes in each one. We'll reconvene back here in about 15.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can agree with that. I feel like, hold on. It's like perfect timing for my 4-year-old to interrupt. I feel the same. I feel like a lot of clients are saying that it's helpful for them. This seems to be like what I would call just that anecdotal evidence. I've always had a lot of concerns just because there isn't any research. There's no research that supports it. There's no science behind it at this point in time. And doesn't seem like there's a likelihood that there will be science behind it anytime soon, just because of the, where we're at as far as the legalization of it. I feel like I've known people throughout different phases of my own life who have like smoked marijuana and still been pretty productive people, and they haven't, they're not huge couch potatoes, or they can still manage, to take care of their responsibilities and stuff. Put it in my hand, please. But there's also that potential, I think, for people to take advantage
in drug and alcohol. So, but I'm sure that some of my clients that are coming to me for their mental health issues are still going to have, I'm sure I'm going to still be seeing people who are taking medical marijuana in an attempt to help their anxiety.
Right. I have a client that had been smoking it daily, multiple times a day for years. And he's up on federal charges, and he knew how important it was for him to get clean, not for using, but for selling his charges. And lo and behold, he's been clean now, I think 2.5 months, and his anxiety has decreased.
Interesting.
Much to his surprise.
Yeah, I had a young man, he was 19 when he came to me for drug and alcohol. This was like 6 years ago. And marijuana, high anxiety and stuff. He came back to me about a year ago for mental health, depression, anxiety. He no longer smokes now, and he's basically cut out drinking. And it's been amazing to see the change in him.
Yes, because it's just not. I do fall in line exactly where Kim is on this. I would like to see it legalized for a number of other reasons. not as a treatment for 100,000 different conditions. However, I am also aware of, when you legalize it, okay, there's such a thing as the law of unintended consequences. Studies have shown that in states where that it has been legalized for recreational use, there has been a marked increase in DUIs. Okay, having said that, alcohol's been legal for a number of years now. We've sort of kind of learned how to live with that, even though it, accidental death, traffic accidents caused by alcohol continue to be a major problem. It's gone down a little bit in recent years. Do we now want to add another agent to that? But, also the realist in me tells me, look, whether it's legal or not, if you want to use it, you'll find a way to get it. So, the whole thing is just very cloudy. So that's what I got on it.
I agree with everybody so far. I mean, it's just so gray. And I think like Kim was saying, like, I'm not anti-pot, but I'm pro-science. And if I don't have the thing behind me to say, like that this is proven to work and that this is a good idea and that it can be safe, then I have a really hard time standing behind it. For mental health, for drug and alcohol, for whatever. Obviously, I've had clients that have the medical marijuana card for like seizures or for, like the physiological stuff, and it works wonders. But it's also been studied and it's been trialed, and, we've done all of these things and it works. Okay, so, to go for it. But, when you have such conflicting studies for things like anxiety or depression or PTSD, like it's really hard to get behind it 100%. So I just have a hard time really, I guess, just picking a side. And I tend to lean on the side of cautiousness. Like I'd rather say, like, can we try everything else that we already have studied? And then if that doesn't,
or people who go to jail. But it's also at the corporate level as well, because cannabis industries are almost always white owned. And so, like we say, oh, we want it to be legalized, we want it to benefit people of color. But then at the corporate level, that's not happening. So I think that's something else that needs to be considered.
That's why I found it interesting, that video from Allison Hill. And what I'm guessing the people who were founding the thing that they said weren't from Harrisburg, appeared to both be Caucasian in that community. Just found it very interesting.
Maybe sometimes with my teens, but they're under 18. It's not going to happen anyway for now. But I do work with a family, and the girl is about 6 or 15, and she has autism, and they were trying to explore and like look more into CBD oil. They didn't really see any benefits from it. They didn't use it for very long, but they were even worried about like talking with their psychiatrist about it. So I encouraged them to share that with her, because I felt like it, she needs to know if they're trying. And I don't think that there's anything wrong. They were pretty desperate because nothing really was working. But that's really the only experience I have on the job with anything like that.
And that's really interesting to me. I'm wondering what kind of interactions even the CBD oil might have with other prescriptions that a client might have, especially if they're on the spectrum. If they use it for a short time, how do they validate whether it's useful or not?
That is actually, Bernadette, a big concern, is that there is some research to suggest that it minimizes like it has an interaction effect and minimizes the absorption of other medications, specifically heart medications, actually. So individuals that are on different types of heart medications, it can, especially for high blood pressure, I guess it can minimize the absorption of that, therefore putting people at a greater risk.
Huh, interesting.
So a lot of people that I've talked with that have
there isn't also that same, ability to sort of follow up or make sure that there's some accountability on the medical side of things.
It's also, I don't know if this happens in any of your clinic areas, but I know in York, we've had a lot of clients report where some of these doctors like pop up. They have like pop-up shops, the clients call them, where they come in for like a day or two and they'll see, 100, however many clients, and it's like 15, 20 minutes and everyone's getting cards and they pay in cash. There's no like insurance reporting or any kind of documentation from family doctor. It's literally client comes in, they say, I have pain, I have anxiety, whatever it may be. And then they get the card and the doctor's gone. Like, cause I've asked clients, do you have any contact information for this doctor? Can we reach out for their documentation? Can we get some paperwork explaining why this was recommended? And clients don't even know the doctor's name, so there's this like really big disconnect between what is happening and how people are getting access to it versus, having deep conversations with their providers about what could be best for their care.
We're going to talk about that as a whole, but one of the things that we're seeing is that, that's plainly illegal. So even if you look at the medical marijuana legislation, there's a lot that I don't agree with, including a number of diagnoses that have no research to support it. However, one of the things that is very clearly delineated in the guidelines is that the certifying physician is supposed to follow that client and maintain that client's care and monitor its impact and all that kind of good stuff. And at present, none of that is happening. The clients are getting certified, they're getting their cards, and they're going. But no, the physicians are not following them and are not monitoring for the most part. I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule, but for the specific like cannabis doctors, not happening. It's scary.
It would just be very convenient if like federally, like I know like it's not legal federally, but if the federal government would allow for there to be the research so that way we actually had the actual answers rather than giving this whole, I don't know, we're not sure, like if there could be the federal research to kind of actually
for anything, but they have specific providers that they can send them to that they know specifically prescribe it, if that makes any sense.
They don't condone it, but then they do.
Give everybody a chance to come back to the main area. All right, it looks like everyone has pretty much made their way back into the main room. Any overarching themes that y'all noticed from your various breakout rooms? Any perceptions or beliefs? I really want to create a dialogue. I mean, I guess I probably shouldn't have led as heavily with my opinion. And I'm very open to hearing the opinions of those around. I just really want to see that we're also sort of aware of some of the downsides. So what did y'all tend to discuss or or what did y'all notice show up in your various breakout rooms?
So we noticed a common theme in that we're getting a lot of people, or I shouldn't say a lot, but each one of us have at least had like one or two patients that have arrived thinking that our clinics are medical marijuana prescribing facilities. So, and and in addition to that, we're seeing a lot of people that are argumentative and angry or upset when we recommend a group or IOP because they are testing positive for marijuana. Like they see it as it's not a problem. So those are the two things that we really hardcore discussed.
Any other general themes that y'all are noticing?
Not exactly the same thing that Nicole's talking about, but we also talked about sort of the frustration in treating individuals that are particularly like drug and alcohol treatment individuals who do have a medical marijuana card, and just that's just a very complicated thing to deal with in a treatment setting.
Others?
We noticed a difference in the legal system and how probation officers are handling it, and that some lawyers are recommending get your medical card, it'll get you out of this DUI charge, or some probation, like in Lebanon County, are very much against it and won't allow them to have a medical card. So it's just a big difference in the legal system as well as to how they're reacting to it.
No, the probation decision in Lebanon County has gone all the way up to the ACLU. I mean, there's a federal lawsuit surrounding that, but probation's rationale in Lebanon is the same as PCS's in that it's we receive federal funding. We simply cannot support it at this time, but that it could be approved. I guess probation does allow it to be approved on a case-by-case basis. They just will not approve it for the basis of mental health disorders due to the lack of evidence. But if a client has cancer or something like that, Lebanon will approve it on that basis. Anything else that y'all have noticed?
Well, so for our room, Kim, there was just the overriding theme was it's uncertain. Uncertainty was the overriding theme. But I always went back to, if I haven't learned anything else, what I do know is that if you give an alcoholic or an addict a mood-altering substance and you tell them it's okay to use this, they're not going to they're going to abuse it. That's just that simple. And that complicates the hell out of everything.
In our group, some of us were mentioning those of us who have worked with adolescents and I've had adolescent clients who are smoking marijuana and they're getting it from those who have medical marijuana cards. So.
Well, that's not okay.
Right.
On a number of levels. Yeah. And we'll get into it a little bit, but regardless of your opinions on marijuana or medical marijuana or anything else, the evidence of marijuana and cannabis on the developing brain is pretty alarming. So even if we're moving towards its use for adults, it is pretty suggestive of having a negative impact on a developing brain up until the age of 25. So I think that that's always important to be mindful of. Anything else before we move on?
I thought it was really interesting that somebody in our group, I won't say her name, but she has used CBD. She did her own personal test, and lo and behold, she did test positive for THC, which is a big twice. And if she wants to talk about it, she can. But that's very disconcerting to me.
I'll address that. It was me.
It was you, Susan, wasn't it?
It was. It was about a year ago. I was having some joint pain, and I got down here at Queens, the CBD, and it's got trace of THC. They say like less than 0.03. And I don't know if it's because, I have a higher percentage of body fat and all that, but I was curious. So I tested myself twice and it came up as positive for marijuana. And I haven't smoked marijuana for years. I don't go in a room.
Week, right?
What?
I said at least a week, right?
At least a week. I don't hang out in enclosed spaces with people So I had no exposure to marijuana, so I do not take that anymore. I've tried the stuff from my Plexus company that has absolutely no THC, and because it scared the crap out of me. Like, what if I get in an accident and I get tested and they say I have marijuana in my system and I work here and do drug and alcohol? So it really scared me, but it did happen. It can come up positive for marijuana with the stuff you buy like at the gas station or whatever.
Yeah, I think that that's the overwhelming literature on CBD, is that it's really not monitored. So, I mean, you could get CBD from one place and it have a very different sort of outcome or experience than another place. And it's just kind of hard to, it's not tracked or monitored by the FDA. The claims haven't been thoroughly evaluated. And I did also personally try CBD oil because I have chronic back pain and don't like taking muscle relaxants because that just kind of knocks me out. So I tried CBD, and I didn't test myself. I probably should have, but I saw no positive impact from it. It didn't do anything for me. Any other thoughts or reactions before we move on?
I think what you said earlier about people at the dispensary having to have a license in order to do that, but the license is a 4-hour training, just kind of shocked me. And like, it was concerning because they are giving like prescriptions to people that are in need, and they only have 4-hour training when there's like medical doctors to help in other areas of life. So keeping up with license, that's good, but at the same time, a 4-hour training isn't gonna, I personally don't think that that's going to do anything for someone, because like there's a lot of things that go into it and they might not even know it with that 4-hour training.
Another very common problem in more rural areas, so probably most of the counties we serve, is that the dispensary will literally run out by like 10 a.m. So individuals who need a certain strain or a certain type, or kind of depending on what they're looking for, whether it be roller balls or loose leaf, there's all different ways that you can ingest medical grade cannabis and street cannabis, frankly, at this point in time. But there's not a lot of ability to go in and sort of select what has worked for you historically, or select that with lower THC or higher THC or whatever it is, because the access to the product is there's a number of barriers there, and it's significantly more expensive at a dispensary compared to street marijuana. So a lot of people will buy weed from the street but use their medical marijuana card in an effort to kind of say like, well, look, I can smoke this. But even if if it's purchased from the street, there is no quality control. At least that which has been purchased from a dispensary, we're relatively sure it is what it claims to be, versus if purchased off the street, there's not much management of that. And I've seen reports most recently of marijuana being seized with trace amounts of fentanyl in it. And so I mean, that obviously poses a number of significant safety concerns as well. So that's part of why our policy here at our agency is that if you are smoking medical marijuana and have the medical marijuana card, you also need to provide us with a receipt of purchase from a validated medical marijuana dispensary, so that we know that you're not buying weed off. And I've had clients say like, well, I'm just smoking weed, da da da. And it's like, well, you're also testing positive for like meth or like these other things. So it's important to kind of to marinate on that and look at that. So for those, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Can you say more, or maybe it's coming up in the training, more about the effects of medical marijuana on the developing brain, like say if it's a teenager?
Yes, we will talk about that in a little bit. I have a couple slides specifically devoted to it, but the research is not positive that it essentially impacts myelination and slows down the development of myelination. So, and there's no rebound effect when the teen stops smoking. So that's what they've really studied to see, like, all right, if during these 3 months they don't myelinate as quickly, which has to do with the speed in which our brain processes information, right? So it you have a finite period of your life where a lot of that occurs. And if you're smoking marijuana during that window, it slows down that development. But I do have a couple of slides a little bit later on in the training.
There was a point that I brought up about what you were talking about a second ago with people getting street marijuana and not really knowing what's in it. I'm from Southern California, where it's totally recreational legal, so I will be the spokesperson for that kind of culture shift. But one thing that I've noticed, and one thing that I am grateful for about it being recreational legal, is there's labels on everything now, especially when you get it from a dispensary. Like, it was quite shocking to go into a dispensary when it was recreationally legalized, and there's like a pot brownie that is in like a sealed package, and it has a nutritional label. I know how many calories are in that pot brownie, and it was very kind of shocking, and it was a strange time to be alive. But you have that much more knowledge of what's actually in it, even if we don't have any data of what this is going to do to me. That's just that much more knowledge compared to what you get off of the street. Which I think is definitely a pro to having it legalized.
Absolutely. And I think also one of the things that I was reading about the states in which it is legal is that those pot brownies or gummy bears or whatever are in child-proof packaging. Because that is also an unintended side effect, especially as we see the increase in edibles within our culture, which has a lot of positive benefits. It has a less impact on the lungs or things like that. But edibles, like street edibles, again, are not very well regulated or monitored. And there's a lot of instances of kiddos like eating one of mom's brownies and like thinking it's okay and then being high out of their minds. And I mean, the good news is it's unlikely that any true long-lasting harm will become of that child, but they can overdose, they can start vomiting excessively. Like they'll probably be okay, but it's certainly not a positive experience. And people just aren't as monitored around it, and kids see it, and it's like kids aren't going to pick up a joint and smoke it, but if they see, I don't know, a gummy bear, mine's going to eat it for sure. And so, you know, if they're not in those tamper-proof packaging and things like that, it makes it higher risk for the kiddos.
Yeah, like the products are in a child-proof bag, and then when you go into the dispensary, they put it in like an extra child-proof kind of Ziploc baggie, but it's complicated. Like the person had to show me how to open it. So it was also Laura proof temporarily. So, I mean, they do take some kind of precaution. I'm sure people are still going to be stupid and jeopardize other people, but they do take steps, and it's part of their licensure that they have to maintain those safety precautions.
Yeah, I mean, I went into one when we were in Seattle. I'd never seen it before. And Seattle, I expected it. I mean, obviously I'm from around here, middle of nowhere. I thought it was going to be like a head shop. Like, no, it's very clinical. It's very clean. Like everything's behind glass. I thought like there were going to be fish posters on the wall. Like that's what I had envisioned. And I walked in, and it feels very, but this again, recreational use, not medical use, but it felt very medical. I mean, everything very, I guess I just had very different expectations. I thought I was walking in there and, you know, Grateful Dead would be playing. I was frankly a bit disappointed, but it felt like a CVS. I mean, it truly just felt like a pharmacy. So anything else before we move on?
I was just going to say that I know in Pennsylvania, at dispensaries, they aren't allowed to sell edibles. Like you're not going to walk in and see like a brownie or a cookie, because it's very hard to know the outcome of like what you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe that they do sell like their little capsules, I think, that you can like take.
Oh, I don't know about that. I know they sell the oil that you
they sell oil and lotion, or
oil, lotion. I know you can vape, and Pennsylvania has been approved for loose leaf, so you can buy just
Yeah, the edibles in Pennsylvania are those capsules. Like if you get edibles, it's the little capsules.
It's a pill. Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so we will just keep rolling here, but great participation, y'all. It's always nice when I don't have to just sit and talk for 4 straight hours. I get sick of my own voice.
Speaking of edibles, I shared in my group, I saw in the newspaper this morning, the Turkey Hills in Elizabethtown have been selling CBD edibles, and they got cited by the Department of Health, and they have to remove them in the food inspection. So there are like 3 Turkey Hills in Elizabethtown that it's reported that,
They got in trouble?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're just, so yeah, I took a screenshot of it. Turkey Hill, food facilities selling gels and other food items containing CBD oil, which is not an approved additive. They need to be immediately removed from sale.
I wonder if it's the same for, like, I know in Carlisle, there's like the CBD shaman place. And I bought CBD oil from there one time. But they do definitely have gummies. So I wonder if it's the same for those shops as well, if it's just like gas stations.
Now, these were like 3 Turkey Hills actually in Elizabethtown, and I've seen them in there when I've been in there. And I thought that's interesting, but I didn't know that edibles were not permitted, but they've been selling them for a couple months.
So when it comes to marijuana, there is sort of acute marijuana intoxication, the effects of which can be anything from euphoria, subjective quickening of associations, so sort of that making sort of links between things that may not otherwise be linked, relaxation, decreased motor activity, a sense of calm, increased awareness of sensory experiences or internal body sensations, transient sensory experiences, synesthesia, craving of sweet or salty foods, enhanced perception of current activities, increased salience of stimuli, simultaneous focusing on multiple things, impaired shifting of focus, fantasies of power and belief of her arriving at transcendent insight. So these are some of the most common experiences of acute marijuana intoxication. Some of the most common side effects include anxiety, panic, paranoia, dry mouth, red eyes, hunger, impaired memory, poor muscle control, slower reaction times, and sleepiness or lethargy. And so that's one of the #1 reasons why marijuana intoxication, even if approved for recreational use or even if approved for medical use, still should not be recommended for those operating like vehicles or large machinery or different things, because you do just have those delayed reaction times. It's not considered a safe for driving type of activity. Marijuana intoxication is associated with deficits in processing speed, attention, working memory, decision-making, motivation, time perception, and reality testing. And considering the broad range of effects, one can begin to imagine how marijuana could have beneficial or harmful effects in regards to mental health. Sorry, I need to switch my screen for you all.
A councilman from Dearborn, Michigan is outraged over a 911 call. He wants to know why no charges have been filed against a police officer who admits to confiscating marijuana from suspects and then baking it in brownies. And once he and his wife were full and high, they thought they'd overdosed and called 911.
I think I'm having an overdose of so is my wife.
Overdose of what?
Marijuana. I don't know if it had something in it. Can you please send rescue?
Did you guys have fever or anything?
No, I think we're dying.
How much did you guys have?
I don't know. We made brownies, and I think we're dead. Time is going by really, 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 really slow.
Well, instead of being charged, sorry. Instead of being charged, the police department let the officer resign. His wife was not charged either. So far, police officials have not commented on the case.
Now, how do you follow a story like that?
Screen sharing has failed. That's not great. So obviously, some panic can be a side effect of marijuana use or acute marijuana intoxication. Getting medical marijuana through Pennsylvania's medical program involves 4 basic steps. So you register through the program through the medical marijuana registry. You have a physician certify you that you suffer from one of the medical conditions that qualify you for medical marijuana. You pay for the medical marijuana ID card, and you get marijuana from an approved dispensary. Very specifically, so I'm going to switch. Sorry, this is a lot harder to do. And hopefully everyone can see that. So here at Pennsylvania, they have a very long list of doctors willing to certify you in medical marijuana, as you can see. None of these doctors are able to also accept federal funding, so it does require them to limit their practice, but it sounds as though they are doing just fine. And these are all of the different physicians certified within your area. The other thing to keep in mind is that Pennsylvania does have a very specific program to show you exactly how to get medical marijuana. So as it turns out, Pennsylvania has some very clear steps. So here it is. Start out by calling this phone number. Is it this easy to get treatment for anything else in the state of Pennsylvania? I don't know, but it's really easy to get a medical marijuana card in the state of Pennsylvania. And look at all of the nice, clear step-by-step instructions that we're provided by. Now, if you're feeling suicidal, is it as easy to get access to treatment? And I would go as far as to say, no, there's not as clean or clear. So I think it's really important to also notice some of the secondary gain presently being obtained through the medical marijuana industry and recognizing the individuals who are benefiting from it. But to see if you qualify, go ahead and click right here, and you can see all of the qualifying conditions within the state of Pennsylvania, so that by the time you meet with your doctor, you know exactly what condition you have. And you will see on here, anxiety disorder, addiction substitute therapy, post-traumatic stress disorder are all considered approved mental health diagnoses. The other one that we have seen most recently added is autism, and they are actively seeking to add ADHD. Now, as you can imagine, some of my concern comes from the area that there is literally no evidence to support the use of marijuana in the treatment of autism. And who has a tendency to have the highest percentage of autism diagnoses? Small kids. So we also don't have any research to suggest what the long-term impact of marijuana use on young autistic kiddos is going to have. But it is an approved treatment in the state of Pennsylvania, and you can get certified for the low, low rate of $225. Medical marijuana throughout the state of Pennsylvania. So this is where you can see all of the different dispensaries that we presently have within the state. And more are being added sort of every couple of months. They're really expanding their impact in their practice. As you can see, of the approved diagnoses, anxiety disorders, autism, and PTSD are among those that are mental health diagnoses. And so that's where we're really going to gear our discussion for the remainder of the day. Most recently in Pennsylvania, they've made over $500 million in sales with about 147,000 people currently certified and 65,000 people using dispensaries. So as you can see, the percentage of individuals who are legally certified are not obtaining their marijuana through legal means, overwhelmingly so. So if you have 150 some odd people currently certified, but only 65,000 individuals actually visiting dispensaries, a good half of that is coming from the street. The average purchase at a dispensary is $120, which I just thought was interesting. The data begs the question. So only 45% of those certified are purchasing from a dispensary. Where are the other 56% purchasing their medical marijuana? And if they're not purchasing medical marijuana, why did they get a card? So this is the rationale by PCS's policy that if someone's providing a medical marijuana card, they must also provide receipts from a legal dispensary to ensure that they're obtaining their marijuana via legal means. Also, this was very, very popular a couple of months ago, but individuals who were buying knockoff vape pens or knockoff vape cartridges, individuals that's being made on the street. And so the oil that was being utilized was vitamin E oil, which is great for a lot of things. If you have a scar, just shove some vitamin E oil on it. It's going to be excellent. However, you don't want vitamin E oil in your lungs. So a lot of bootleg marijuana has been tied to it's not the actual cannabis that's making people sick, but it's the substance in which the THC is suspended. That's what was making people sick. And it was overwhelmingly impacting younger kiddos younger teens and adolescents. What we're also seeing is a significant increase in vaping in general among the adolescent population. And I've been talking to different school districts. They're having a really hard time managing it because back when I was in high school, not that I ever did, y'all, but if I would have smoked cigarettes in the high school bathroom, an alarm goes off, people come running. It's very easy to get caught doing that. But the vape doesn't set off an alarm in the bathroom. The other thing is if you're smoking a cigarette, you're smoking a cigarette. So it has this finite start and end time. You smoke a cigarette and it burns for 3 to 4 minutes, it's gone. A vape pen isn't something that has that finite start and end time. So what we're seeing is that adolescents especially, but it's an issue sort of across the board, are consuming higher and higher percentages of nicotine and or THC should they be vaping it, because there is no finite start and end time. And what I've seen in talking to school districts is that adolescents are taking their sweatshirts, tying or sewing a little they're learning to sew, y'all, so that's beneficial, but they're sewing a little pocket right on the inside of their sweatshirt. They slide their vape pen down, which you can see looks just like down here. It looks almost like a thumb drive or a flash drive. And many of them do actually plug into computers to charge. They can charge it through a flash drive or like a charging Apple, like the blocks that go in the wall for Apple. And so they just slide it down in their shirt. And when the teacher turns around in the classroom, they do one of these. And it's very subtle, but more and more they're seeing the need to confiscate different vape pens within the classroom in a high school.
There was actually a, I want to say it was like one of the NBC like news reports, where they did this whole thing of like how like vapes look so vastly different now. Like there's so many different versions of them. So they literally had set up, they set up a classroom really, and then had parents come in and see if they could point out, like figure out which items were the vape pens. And, you know, they were things that looked like pens. They were things like USB drives. They were like their actual, like the actual sweatshirt, like the cords of the sweatshirt.
Lipstick.
Yeah, lipstick, part of their backpack, like part of the water bottle. Whatever way they could be disguised, so like parents couldn't even figure out like which items were the actual vape pens because they were so well disguised.
I hate to interrupt, but Luke is stuck in the waiting room.
Oh. Here we go. Hopefully he's
my device won't charge, so I'm actually going to switch devices and we'll also be in the waiting room soon.
Sure thing. I will keep it open again. I had closed it because I was like, everyone's here now.
Thank you. Okay.
So, just general facts about marijuana use in the United States. Marijuana is still the most common drug of abuse within the U.S. One study in 2015 found that 22 million people ages 12 and older had used marijuana within the past month. Research suggests that marijuana use has increased over the past decade as perceptions of risk of harm from marijuana among adults and the general population has steadily declined. As of June 2017, 26 different states and the District of Columbia have enacted laws to have the legalization of marijuana use in some form, and 3 additional states recently passed permitting for medical marijuana.
Can I ask a question about that, Kim?
Yeah.
So the statement there, marijuana is the most commonly used drug of abuse in the United States. Is that illegal drug? Because I just feel like alcohol is more commonly used than marijuana. Is it because alcohol is legal? Are they separating alcohol and drugs? I'm just surprised. Like, I figured alcohol would be the most used drug of abuse in the United States.
They are using it on the basis of the definition of abuse. So they're peeling off like those who drink alcohol socially, and a lot of that falls to self-report, right? So it's likely some skewed data in that particular area, because I have had plenty of clients that will drink a 5th of vodka a day, but it's just social drinking. So I think that it has to do with, and because the abuse literature, to receive a diagnosis of abuse, one of the diagnostic criteria is legal problems or employment problems associated with. So you're much more likely to have legal or employment problems associated with marijuana compared to alcohol, if that makes sense. You know, like you can get the alcohol related legal problems, but you need to be driving or drunk in public or.
Yeah, that was my my question about the criteria for drug of abuse. And so, no, that does make sense as far as the definition of abuse and legal problems and employment problems being a part of that, and therefore marijuana qualifying for that. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for going over that.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Mental health conditions figure predominantly among the reasons given for medical marijuana use. However, as we've mentioned, probably 30,000 times already, and I'll likely say it 30,000 times again, there's a significant lack of rigorous, experimentally controlled studies in this particular area. So the short-term effects, this particular study, and I had to screenshot the topic, or I had to screenshot the author page because this is marijuana research from a woman named Susan A. Stoner. And just come on, does it come any more perfect than that? But so this particular study, The Effects of Marijuana on Mental Health by Susan A. Stoner, found that the short-term use produces short-term effects. However, long-term use is associated with an increase in both anxiety and substance use disorders. And I think that's why I feel so passionately about this. I have a tendency to specialize in the addiction field, and I work primarily with those within the addictions field, and have found a number of individuals that started out with marijuana use, whether through medical certification or through street marijuana, and they said, well, you know, it helps me stay calm, it helps me relax. I've had a number of clients use marijuana to ameliorate the symptoms of detox from opiate use, opiates or even methamphetamine. So I've worked with a number of individuals who have self-medicated with marijuana, and every single one of these clients that I can think of eventually returned to their drug of choice. So the concern from my perspective has to do with the long-term impact of marijuana use. And while it does appear to help maybe short-term, especially in association with anxiety, and even when it comes to detoxification from those more severe substances of abuse, and even I, who've kind of devoted my life to combating the disease of addiction, will very readily admit that if I'm going to have a client who's smoking, who's using a substance, I would much rather have a client that's abusing marijuana than a client who's like intravenously using heroin. And I think about it like from a parent perspective. When my my kids are 2 and 4 right now, but if 10 years from now I walk into a room and I find a substance, I sure hope it's weed and that it's not heroin. So we are here to talk about this in terms of nuance. And I think we all need to be able to kind of lean in and have a more nuanced discussion about how marijuana might not be as helpful as we're touting it, and perhaps it's not as harmful as the other substances of abuse. And maybe a common argument is marijuana might not even be as harmful as alcohol, or that's an argument that I hear from a lot of our clients, that, well, it's safer than alcohol, or it's legal in 26 states, or it's this or it's that. And cheeseburgers are legal. That doesn't mean that you should eat one every day. There are still negative impacts of different things. And so anytime you're putting a substance into your lungs, there are medical downsides to that. And I think it's important to explore. In this particular study, CBD did demonstrate some positive impacts, and THC demonstrated more positive impacts at very, very low doses, or what they call microdoses, which is 5 milligrams or less. The problem is, especially when it comes to loose leaf or vaping, it's very hard to control that milligram. So in terms of edibles, capsules, gummies, it's much easier to figure out the dosage of each substance, of each ingestation. But when it comes to smoking or oil or loose leaf, it's really, really difficult to sort of manage that dosage. And what we're starting to discover is that THC might have some positive impacts on anxiety at those very low micro doses, but does not necessarily have a positive impact on anxiety for anything above those micro doses. So really important nuance for us to keep in mind. THC has been shown to decrease anxiety when utilized in those very, very small doses during the acute anxiety stage. So sort of similar to like a Klonopin during an acute anxiety attack. Let's say you have a fear of flying and you fly 2 times a year. Klonopin, if you have panic attacks every time you fly and you fly twice a year, Klonopin might be an effective treatment. But let's say you have panic attacks. Let's say you're an Iraqi war veteran, recently returning from a combat zone, and you have a panic attack every time you get behind your car to drive. Now, is Klonopin the effective treatment for that particular anxiety disorder? My excellent clinicians in the room. I'm hearing a no. What else? No, because it's not safe. You shouldn't be taking Klonopin and driving. And so the same would be true for THC. THC does impair reaction times. And given that it's very difficult to determine dosage, it would be extremely difficult to determine what is considered safe. That has been one of the rationale behind states saying that they can't legalize it yet for recreational purposes, is that short of a blood draw, it's very hard to determine the level of THC available within someone's body at any given time. There have been different types of testing that's come out, and there is even a THC breathalyzer. But again, as with everything else we're going to talk about today, its success rates kind of suck. There is also no evidence to suggest that THC impairs anxiety beyond that acute intoxication phase. So once the body synthesizes the THC and it's out of your system within the acute intoxicant phase, we know that it stays within our system from anywhere 15 to 45 days, depending on body fat composition and route of ingestion and a whole number of other factors. There's no evidence to suggest that it continues to reduce anxiety during that time. And so because I have a tendency to operate from an acceptance and commitment framework of therapy, I think it's very important for us to recognize that avoidance has a tendency to not have long-term positive impacts on anxiety. So let's say I am, once again, an Iraqi war veteran returning from a combat or a theater of war, and I have a lot of anxiety every time I go to Walmart. So I go to Walmart, I step in, man, I have a complete panic attack. I've got to go. I get out. whoo, the minute I walk through those doors, my anxiety goes down. So from a behavioral perspective, what did I learn? I learned that Walmart's bad, makes me anxious. I'm not going to go anymore. I can avoid Walmart. So I stopped going to Walmart. Then I go to Target, which is only the red Walmart, but we like to pretend that it's different. But I walk in and I'm acting as if this is going to be a different experience. I have an acute anxiety attack again. I leave. The minute I leave, I notice my anxiety dip. It's reinforced. What do I learn? I learn that I can't go to Target. That's fine. Amazon Prime exists. I can literally get anything off the internet. I don't need to leave my house, as many of us have learned over the last 4 months. And so I don't leave my house, and I'm able to order everything through Amazon Prime. And so far, life's going really, really, really well. But maybe in the year 2021, my kid is graduating from high school. And all of a sudden, I found one thing that I don't get to do online. Now, 2020 has shown us that maybe you can do that online as well. But let's say we have a vaccine and big parties are available again. At that point in time, I now need to make a choice between my acute anxiety or my ability to go into a group setting, or continue to avoid the things that are important to me. So as you can see, let's say you're not physically leaving a situation anymore, but if you're psychologically turning down the volume of your anxiety through the ingestion of a substance, whether it be alcohol, marijuana, or a benzodiazepine, you're only reinforcing that avoidance pattern, and it doesn't long-term lead to a reduction in anxiety symptoms. Does that make sense to everyone? Is everyone picking up what I'm putting down here?
Wasn't one of your bullet points before that THC actually impacts that associative learning, which is basically what PTSD is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you speak a little more about that, like about that relationship?
So individuals have a much greater likelihood to have those jumpings to conclusion, like to engage in that jump to conclusion process, and maybe pull together things that are loosely related or perhaps even not related at all. So I always like to use the example of like a, like if I had, oh gosh, I just lost the word, but I'm having word find problems. I'm not acutely intoxicated, y'all. But if you have that, so individuals that have like a lucky charm, what am I thinking of? Not a stereotype. That's the word that keeps coming to mind.
Behavior?
No.
Superstition?
Superstition. Thank you. That's the word I was trying to find. So different superstitious behaviors can arise through these sort of cognitive pairings of unrelated stimuli, and individuals during an acute intoxication phase are much more likely to jump to these conclusions with these unrelated pairings of stimuli. So they might then land upon, okay, well, when I'm out and about in public, I find myself really acute in this acute anxiety phase. But I found that if I'm high, then I'm much less likely to have that acute anxiety. But perhaps I'm now pairing together these other safety behaviors that aren't necessarily tied to one another. So like individuals that will get up and do like room checks or something like that, they might be pairing these safety behaviors that aren't truly eliciting safe practices, which would be fine if it's just like, oh, well, when I wear purple, I'm safer. But unfortunately, what we're also seeing is certain safety behaviors that have to do with like where you drive on a road, or things that could result us to have that paradoxical intention, and that the harder we seek to obtain safety, the more we engage in high risk behaviors that actually, instead of eliciting feelings of safety, cause us to put ourselves in objectively less safe situations. Does that make sense? Why that might be an issue. All right, I think that we have landed at a spot where I would like to go ahead and pause here, give everybody a break, go refresh your water, head to the bathroom, do whatever you gotta do, and we will come back in just a minute. So thank you all, and give yourself 15, and I'll see you back here soon. It is really loud in my house right now. Can you all hear that? Do you hear the crashing and the screaming? Okay, good.
No, I can't hear anything.
That's a delight then. I'm really happy about that. We have my sister-in-law and nephew. So I've got 3 small children right above me. And it also sounds like the world is ending. So it's good to know.
I was taking care of 4 dogs yesterday and trying to do Zoom sessions, and and of course the mailman and UPS came, and I was like, I am so sorry for all the barking. And I couldn't mute my microphone because I was the one talking. So
yeah, that's I was on a Zoom call the other day, and sometimes I just call in if it's, so I don't have to be on the screen, just take a break, rest my eyes. And we hatched the chickens right now and are raising them till they're big enough to go outside. So they're all in the basement right now. And somebody is like, are you like at an animal sanctuary? Like, what is that? No. And it's just like baby chicks chirping in the background. But I think it's quite soothing. So I'll go.
yeah. Our animals don't care about Zoom.
No. I know our dog certainly doesn't. I don't let him on while I'm trying to train anymore because he literally tries to, and he's big now. He just right here the whole time. So he gets locked out while I'm training now.
My dog loves Zoom. She hears people talking and is like, oh boy, there's people here. I want to see them.
That's him too. He's like, what are you guys doing? It's like, nobody. Like, we're
I
not.
have a cat who likes Zoom. He gets on my lap and he just stares at people like.
All right. So we're going to keep rolling here. Oh. And I got all jumped down. So, yeah, we are going to get going. And so we just kind of reviewed the literature associated with anxiety. And basically the research is, again, very, very sparse in this particular area. But what we are finding is that while it might be effective for the short term, it does not appear to be effective for the long-term treatment of anxiety disorders, which is honestly very, very similar to the benzodiazepine literature, which there is significantly more of. So if you look at the benzodiazepine literature, what we've found is that it's effective during the acute anxiety phase, but the long-term impact of the use of a benzodiazepine actually is resulting in a higher incidence of anxiety overall, especially with daily or regular use. The other thing that's pretty alarming from the benzodiazepine literature has to do with habituation, and that over time, individuals need a higher and higher dose to experience the same effect. And that's no different than what we're presently seeing with the marijuana literature, that individuals are finding that they're habituating to the substance of abuse, or they're habituating to the substance and requiring those higher and higher doses to have the exact same impact overall. So I think that's another thing that is causing some concern for those of us within the field, is that we are recognizing that while those microdoses might be effective in the very short term, if an individual is to continue to use marijuana, logic would dictate that they would need increased doses in order to experience the same effect. That is a concern for a number of different reasons, obviously, but with the most important being that those microdoses may no longer be effective and therefore not be utilized. Now I'm going to take some time and we're going to y'all sure you can't hear that? Golly, it's loud in this house. I apologize. We're going to break back into the breakout rooms, and I would like each of you to discuss what you were noticing either within your own home clinic or within your own caseload. We're going to have about 15 minutes, then we'll all reconvene and talk as a whole, but specific to cannabis for the treatment of anxiety use disorders. So I'm going to send everybody to breakout rooms now. I will hang out in the main area for a minute because I recognize that sometimes when the breakout groups start, that gets in the way. And so I'm going to send everybody now. Well, no, because now my screen froze. There we go. I'm going to send everyone now. So at around 11:10, I'll send you guys a 2-minute warning as well, but around 11:10, we're all going to come back together.
My experience with this is not, am I glitchy?
Yeah, a little.
Okay. So parents of kids with autism, and I don't know if Kim's gonna talk about that at all. We've had a couple parents who would do various like oils, gummies with their kids, all, you know, some edible stuff too, like since a lot of autism symptoms appear to be like anxiety driven, like avoidance driven, but it's something that we've like offered to help evaluate in an objective way, collect data on, you know, their tolerance of different things, you know, avoidance behaviors or like fidgeting or crying or running away, but I have not observed, you know, when kids were doing the oil and the gummies, like any change in behavior. So that's always what we're looking at as the dependent measure. Because I'm not necessarily against anything if it's not harmful, even though I do talk to parents about issues with the developing brain, but like CBD stuff, topical, you know, probably wouldn't have those type of effects. So that's been my experience with it. And I am really interested in this topic because I do a FADS training here at PCS, like FADS and autism treatment. And I didn't originally have cannabis and marijuana related stuff in there, but I have added it now because it's such a prevalent topic and it's a hot topic. So I've added it, and like most of the stuff is the same as what Kim's saying. Like I had a really hard time finding articles. The only articles I found, at least for autism and the symptoms, are like subjective reports. Like, does a parent say it's better or worse? There might be some checklists involved, like the ABC, like Aberrant Behavior Checklist or Vineland, but nothing like hard and measurable that would at least convince me. So
Yeah,
that's my my experience with it.
Being one of your, I think I was at your one FAD
Oh,
training.
were
and I
you?
remember you mentioning that.
Yeah, I didn't have much in the beginning, but it's growing. So I almost feel like I want to spend more time on it because it's a more pertinent issue now. So it'll be an expanding section for sure.
Yeah,
I hope Kim talks about it a little bit later.
I have had, like I told the group that we were in earlier, I've had a couple clients that have came in for cannabis use disorder.
Everyone should be coming back in. I have somebody in the waiting room again. Someone is stuck in the waiting room. So what showed up in everyone's individual breakout rooms? What's the general consensus when it comes to the treatment of anxiety disorders with medical cannabis?
Well, my group has a lot of folks that are doing children's work, so they haven't had a bunch of opportunities to do that, or they've been involved with the legal system, so they're on the other side of the process where maybe they're working with juveniles who are using or have used in the past. But I've only had a handful of clients myself come in who were trying to like push that you're gonna allow me to be here even though I'm using marijuana for this. And I'm like, well, the thing is, if marijuana is your go-to move, you may not make room for treatment. So I need you to stop for some period of time to at least see if therapy can work for you. And if you can't necessarily agree to that, then I can't agree to keep working with you. So that's been my limited experience thus far.
Do you find success with that, Johnny? Like, are people willing to limit their use in order to engage in treatment, or is it pretty variable?
50-50, to be honest. I had one guy who was just like, well, no, I've got to be able to smoke my weed. And I'm just like, well, you can smoke your weed and work with someone else. And then I had another person who dialed it back, and periodically I would check with them, and they'd be like, "Oh, well, yeah, I might have smoked a couple weeks ago." I'm just like, "All right, here we go." But yeah, it's been 50-50. I think that one client that I'm working with right now actually has stopped smoking and is just doing therapy and seems to be doing very well. But I'm also seeing this person via telehealth, so I don't know how much is really going on. But when we were working in person, they did seem to be on the up and up.
My observation was, and especially as it relates to anxiety, the people who I see getting a medical marijuana card for anxiety were already using marijuana. Like, I don't see anybody who says like, okay, I have anxiety, I've tried everything else, let's try marijuana, and they've never tried it before. So I think it was already something they're using, whether they have anxiety or not. The card just legitimizes it.
You make a great point. I definitely have a client that, particularly would probably fall under that statistic or whatever hypothesis that you're coming up with. He definitely, he got in trouble for marijuana, and 2 years later after his charge, he got a medical marijuana card. So it kind of, makes me think like, okay, like, are you just trying to get this just to get your charge dropped, which is fine. Like, it's not my place to place that judgment, but then he's, arguing with my level of care recommendation. So it's kind of a gray area.
Anything else or any other experiences that y'all are seeing within the clinics? I know that I had a client in particular for many years, and his drug of choice was meth, but he would often use marijuana during the times that he wasn't using meth, not medically, so just whatever he'd scrounge up on the street. And one day he came into my office after not smoking weed for maybe a week and a half or something like that. And he had this massive like aha moment. And said, oh, well, I've stopped smoking weed. And like all of a sudden I just feel more connected with my kids, and I feel more connected to my family, and I'm doing better at work. And it was like this like miraculous veil had lifted from his eyes. And he's like, oh, it turns out that smoking weed all day, every day, like isn't helpful. And he just it was actually pretty cute because he just, like, it had never occurred to him that the constant and chronic smoking of marijuana could be having some potential negative impacts as well. So I think it is really important to encourage our clients to try things a little bit differently as well. So if they're finding that they're running into setbacks in that area, perhaps to tweak things a little bit differently, though I do know that for the most part, individuals are often really unlikely to want to stop or abstain from marijuana use for any extended period of time, even to test the hypothesis. I think it's also really important to mention, and I don't know that we've talked about it yet, but marijuana use is obviously associated with not being a substance that results in a detoxification process or a detox process. And if anybody's ever worked on a detox or even an inpatient facility or even an outpatient, I'm sure you've seen folks detoxing at different points in time. For those that have experience in that particular area, you might not, if you've seen somebody withdrawing from opiates, it's a very clear illness. It looks much like a very serious flu, often with a lot of significant GI distress, sweating. They could even have some seizures or convulsions, though that's much less likely, and in significant physical pain. Marijuana, because of the half-life and how long it remains in one's body, usually there isn't that significant withdrawal experience. However, there is research to support the notion that withdrawal absolutely exists within the marijuana community. It just looks a little bit different. So it might be like headaches, stomach aches, increasing anxiety, difficult sleeping. It's not as severe as withdrawals from other substances of common abuse, but it still does exist. And I think that's important to kind of educate and prepare our clients to interact with, because they may reduce their use of marijuana and then see as a marked increase in sleep-related disturbance or GI upset or nausea or different barriers like that. So I think it is important to provide a little bit of psychoeducation surrounding the drug to our clients so that they understand their experiences. It's very possible that they might find themselves in a situation where their most common drug of abuse, where they are having like medical, almost like a very mild flu right now, would probably be something that people would confuse with COVID-19 or the like. But just something to keep in mind, that marijuana often has the general perception that it's not, that there are no withdrawals, but that is not true. So we've talked about anxiety disorders. Now let's talk about PTSD. So marijuana is legal for the treatment of PTSD in 28 states, including the great state of Pennsylvania. There's insufficient evidence for either the benefit or harm in the condition. When it comes to the positive trends, it really has to do with the area of nightmares and sleep quality. And primarily sleep disturbance is what's cited in those individuals with that are choosing to use marijuana for PTSD. Now, again, sort of very similar to what we were discussing in terms of anxiety disorders, is there isn't much support for the use of PTSD in reducing some of those other symptoms of anxiety. So the hyperarousal, the paranoia, the anxiety, and the whole host of other PTSD related symptoms. Marijuana does not appear to have a positive impact in those areas. So where it really only seems to have a positive impact is in the area of sleep quality. Interestingly, many of the studies suggest that it's actually only the perception of sleep quality, that when you use objective sleep quality studies, like when you hook people up to like, what are they called? The brain scans, where they put the electrodes all over their brain and measure, what are they called? EEGs?
EEG. Yeah.
EEGs. So when they connect somebody up for an EEG or something like that, the research really does show that the brain waves and the REM sleep cycles are actually slightly shorter. So while an individual may perceive their sleep as being higher quality, the objective measures are really showing us that that might not necessarily be true. Now, for individuals that have significant sleep disturbance, such as those with PTSD, that perception of improved sleep quality is likely associated with their subjective experience of waking less throughout the night. So arguably it could have a benefit, though we are recognizing that the overwhelming quality of sleep is likely a little bit lower. I've also read some studies, although it doesn't appear to be very well researched, surprise, surprise, that has suggested an increase in nightmare-related behavior during the detoxification process from marijuana. So that individuals who have long-term chronic use of marijuana, when they discontinue, they have a tendency to have an increase in very vivid dreams, often of a nightmarish content. Really, that's my only slide for PTSD because there is like nil evidence. And so I really do think that that's important to sort of lean into because we also haven't seen any empirically validated evidence of any other medication supporting with PTSD. And there are a number of really well-validated studies to and very well researched treatments for PTSD, which include but are not limited to cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, seeking safety, trauma-focused CBT. So there's a number of really well-validated behavioral and therapeutic interventions for PTSD. And so it is slightly just a little bit alarming that the substance that has zero evidence is not only legal in 28 states, but is encouraged in 28 states. Now, what's interesting is that the VA, because it receives federal funding, will not approve or recommend medical cannabis for the treatment of PTSD. So that's a very large population of human that qualify for PTSD-related diagnoses that do not participate in the use of medical marijuana. Also, a lot of our PTSD research comes out of the VA system because they receive those huge chunks of funding. So federal funding in order to research and improve the way that we interact with this particular diagnosis. It is concerning, again, when that legislation works its way through the House and the Senate, if we are to see marijuana legalized or at the very least decriminalized, my hope is that we will also see an increase in research in this area very specific to this diagnosis, because it does have some promising things in terms of sleep, but sort of beyond that, there's not much. So that's pretty concerning. So when it comes to opiate use disorders, which is where I find the most significant interaction, I would say a majority of the individuals that I've personally interacted with that are on marijuana for mental health disorders, it has been for the treatment of cannabis or cannabis use disorders. It is very important that to the letter of the law, so if you go to the PA website, pa.gov, one of the things that it will specify is that it is only approved for a treatment of opiate use disorders for those who did not respond to more traditional therapies. And its primary use is for both prescription opioids and just as an analgesic, so to kind of numb people out. Currently, about 90% of patients in state-level medical cannabis registries list chronic pain as their qualified condition for the medical program. And patients in these studies report fewer side effects with cannabis than they do with opiate medications, including what they describe as this paradoxical improvement in cognitive functioning, which appears to be just their perception of their cognitive functioning, not necessarily their actual cognitive functioning. Just like I'm a better dancer when I drink, it's just not as legitimate. And better quality of life in cannabis use compared to opiates. Now, I think it's really, really important for us to look at this on sort of two different levels. The first is that cannabis might be a pretty effective treatment for individuals struggling with chronic pain. And very much so, especially when we compare it to opiates and the opiate use. And so if somebody has the choice between Percocets and cannabis, you're much less likely to have negative outcomes on cannabis than on Percocet. So again, this is where that nuanced discussion comes into play. You would probably have even fewer negative outcomes. So let's imagine I have a third hand on nothing at all. But if you have chronic medical pain and need to find a way to alleviate those symptoms, the research really is suggesting that you have fewer negative side effects when utilizing cannabis. What we also know is that in the states that they really used, so in the research that they utilized to allow for the legalization of marijuana for opiate use disorders, they started out with the research that came out of Colorado, California, some of those early adopter states for cannabis for both medical and then future recreational use. What they noticed is that as soon as these, as cannabis became approved for both medical and recreational, what they found is that those same individuals, or in those states, there was a marked decrease in overdoses within each of those states. That correlation has been erroneously related to, like, using marijuana decreases overdoses. And really, when you dig into the data, it's not that clear. It's not that clean. What seems to be probably more likely is that as people increase their use of marijuana as the treatment of a pain disorder or chronic pain related issue, as somebody increases marijuana use, or as states increase that, or doctors increase that as common practice, there's a significant decrease in the use of different opiate-based medications. Therefore, fewer people are developing a long-term dependency upon opiate-based medications, thereby reducing overall overdose rates.
And I can't help but wonder if there's less opiate prescriptions out there, then there's less pills on the street. There's less, someone's got 40 pills of Percocet in their cabinet and maybe a cousin comes over and, hey, I can make a quick buck. Like, I just can't help but wonder if that might not also be a part of the picture.
I'm sure. I'm absolutely. And if you look at even prescription rates in the state of Pennsylvania and beyond, now we are seeing a steady decline. So that's the good news. And we're also seeing a steady decline in the number of doses per prescription. I can remember, I think it was 6 years ago now, I had appendicitis. Appendicitis sucks, y'all. It is very painful. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking I was going to die, and kind of hoping for it, like kind of wishing that that's how the story went rather quickly, because I was in a lot of pain. And it is painful. And I left the hospital with a giant bottle of 120 Percocet. Like, that was my prescription, 120 Percocet. And there was no way for me to say, like, hey, just give me 10 of those. Like, I'm good. I don't need. And so I ended up dropping off probably 110 Percocet at one of those drug drop-off collection places, because I didn't just want it sitting in my medicine cabinet or things like that. So I think you're absolutely onto something with that. As there's an increase in medical marijuana for chronic pain, not only are the individuals that were once upon a time developing a dependency on that substance less likely, but there's a lot less just sort of out there on the streets floating around.
I was telling you, my son just had surgery yesterday on his foot. They basically created an arch. The doctor's like, well, I guess he'll just have to take Motrin, because I don't know with his age, because he's only 15, if I'll be able to prescribe him anything stronger. And I told him, well, you gave it to him when he had the first one done. He got 20 Percocet. That is it.
Mm-hmm. I think it has changed so quick. I mean, to the credit of our medical profession, I think that there was a marked shift in the way we approach pain in this country. And I think it's phenomenal. An excellent book about chronic pain, if you're ever, in the market for a good 700-page read, is called Full Catastrophe Living by Jon Kabat-Zinn. And it's a phenomenal book just about how, like, there are times where the reduction of pain, of physical pain symptoms, leads to a number of other problems for the individual. So even though opiates are pretty effective. I mean, they work. Opiates work to reduce the experience of physical pain, there are worse things than physical pain. And I think that's the thing that they really are exploring, but especially on the developing brain. And what they're finding is more and more adolescents are really struggling with, once that prescription runs out, heading to find street related opiates. And I remember years ago sitting in an NA meeting, with a guy that was like 87, this little old man, and he had been clean, he said, for 40 years. So he had gotten off opiates like in the 70s when he was, you know, in his like 20s or 30s, and had been clean for 40 years. And then he had to have some kind of surgery, was prescribed Percocets at the end of it. And he said, I went right back to becoming he's like, I was 74 years old or whatever he was, and I was back to being an IV drug user just as quickly. So there is a lot of, you know, need for further discussion and exploration in the way we manage pain.
And this every clinic that I've worked at, when we were working at Ren, when we worked at Crossroads, when I worked at Lancaster City, I'm at Columbia now. Every last one of them, I'd say a good 15% of the clients that come in had no history of substance issues, had a surgery, got some type of opiates, couldn't get a refill, and suddenly they were doing street drugs. Like, and that's a rough guess, but I think that's a fair guess at 15%.
No, it truly is pretty alarming when you trace back sort of the addiction process for a lot of our clients. And I remember Mike Fulmer, who was the state senator most recently charged with child pornography. He was also the big medical marijuana advocate for the state of Pennsylvania for the longest time. He is no longer a senator and is a resident of a correctional facility at this point in time. However, about 2 years ago, he came to Crossroads to talk to us about a number of different things. And during that time, he went around the room, and at that time, heavily our percentage of our population was mostly opiate users. Now we see a pretty clear split between opiates and meth, but at the time it was mostly opiate related disorders, and I want to say like 6 out of the 14, it all started with a surgery. Many of them were like athletes in high school and had injuries associated with that. Like we had a couple of hockey players, a couple football players. One was in like a motocross accident, but usually started with some sort of injury that led to a surgery that led to a 120 Percocet pain medication refill. And also, I think it's really important that many of these clients score a bit higher on like that ACEs scale, like the Adverse Childhood Experiences scale. But it appears to be that that's like the interactive effects. So if you have a high level of adverse childhood experiences, you have an injury, you're given an off button. Like they hand you a bottle of 120 off buttons and say, hey, use this wisely. And they find that not only does it turn off the physical pain, but it turns off the psychological pain, because it's not like a door with a doorman, it's a faucet. It's on or off. There's not that in between. And so what they were finding is that individuals would soon fail to recognize the difference between the physical pain and the psychological pain. What we also know is that those who have a history of the disease of addiction measure pain more acutely. So what might be a 4 to me would be an 8 to somebody with a history of addiction. Now, the area in which that research really leaves something to be desired is it's not randomly assigned. So it's really after the fact, retrospectively, they take individuals with a history of substance use disorders and individuals without, and have them rate like certain very similar types of pain, such as childbirth or appendicitis or a torn meniscus, like different things that have a tendency to be similar in terms of pain. And individuals with a history of opiate use disorders will rate pain significantly higher than their non-using counterparts. So it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. You don't know, did they always experience pain at that heightened level, and therefore they were drawn towards that lifestyle of addiction? Or did they, as a result of their opiate use, did it decrease their threshold for pain? Or is it both? Did they start out a little bit higher and it decreased it over time? Did they decrease their ability to manage it? So preclinical trials suggest, so this is on like rats and bunnies and chimps and stuff, that cannabinoid antagonism reduces the rewarding properties of opiates and prevents the reinstatement of drug-seeking behaviors. So like rats, if you give them marijuana, they're less likely to go towards the water bottle with the heroin in it. However, this has not been replicated in humans, y'all. So we use this a lot as where we use this specific study on rats. And then we say, that's why we made all of these legislative choices. And then when we tried to reproduce it in humans, nothing. And that is the exact quote from the discussion section, that despite the promising results of reducing or maintaining a consistent opiate dose, it is plausible that the substitution of one rewarding substance for another could be problematic, leading to cannabis use disorder. Now, we have discussed previously, and I'm sure many on this conference call would agree, that you'd probably much more prefer a loved one or somebody really important to you to have a cannabis use disorder rather than an opiate use disorder. 1-to-1, the odds of overdose are less, the overall negative outcomes appear to be slightly lower, and while we can all probably agree that you would much rather have somebody you care about addicted to marijuana than addicted to opiates, what we are finding and what we've known as a field for a very long time is that addiction and drugs of choice are not mutually exclusive, right? So it's not like, hey, I can only be addicted to meth right now. It's truly that our brains have a tendency to be equal opportunity employers when it comes to our decisions to be impacted more fully by substances. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that while the research does suggest some improvement in certain areas, it doesn't appear to have any long-term positive outcomes. Several studies have shown that adjunct cannabis decreases opiate consumption or prevents opiate escalation. However, several studies have shown that cannabis use either has no impact or may increase non-medical opiate use. And those two exact quotes are from the exact same study. So while it says like, yeah, it might work, like a paragraph later, they say, yeah, maybe it's not going to work at all. So there's a lot of just competing and complex information. Any study that I found that was overwhelmingly positive, when you scroll to the disclosures and read the disclosures, they admit that the study was paid for by a cannabis company. So the only studies that I found that are positive have been paid for by cannabis companies. And cannabis in the state, or I'm sorry, in the country, especially when it comes to medically regulated cannabis, has been a tremendous moneymaker. So even in times of COVID-19, as we've watched the stock market, like soar and plummet. I mean, the stock market's obviously been all over the place day to day. Cannabis related stocks have very, very consistently remained high. I saw a meme where people said, like, the hippies have finally won, weed is legal and haircuts are illegal. But so very much what we are noticing is that the only real positive studies are coming out of the marijuana field. And that's concerning for a number of different reasons. Anybody who can remember back to the times of cigarette smoking and people saying that cigarettes are 100% safe, a lot of those studies came out of the funding for different tobacco companies. So all of that to say, the research is skewed. Short-term studies display lower cravings and increased involvement in treatment, which I thought was delightful. So the company or the treatment programs that give people weed when they show up are much more likely to get people to show up. So it is an effective way to reduce no-show rates. And I suppose if I were to, just think very realistically that we can only help the people for which we can get to come through our doors. So perhaps for a week or two, it could increase treatment compliance. the research did suggest that a reduction in symptoms associated with opiate withdrawal, but they were very poorly controlled studies and were very much just individuals choosing to obtain street weed in an effort to reduce their overall withdrawal symptoms. And there's no significant effect of abstinence or reduction overall long term. So most of these studies were between 2 and 4 weeks. So that's what they mean by long term. They're saying at 4 weeks, there is no overall abstinence from opiates. Before we move on to autism, any thoughts or reactions or experiences from you all? I know we've gone into breakout rooms historically, but I figure maybe we could take a breakout room break and just talk as a community here. Experiences from y'all when it comes to opiate use disorders for either, medical marijuana for either opiate use disorders or PTSD. Have y'all noticed that?
Yeah, I have a very interesting and concerning experience with it. I had a client who was taking Suboxone, and she was seeing a very well-known MAT provider here in Harrisburg, and the doctor recommended medical marijuana to get off the Suboxone. We talked about it. She brought it in, so we talked about it. We discussed the research, and then she went back to meet with him for the actual interview or the session to see if she could get medical marijuana. And she came back saying that, well, it changed. Now it's because of PTSD. It's that he diagnosed her with PTSD. So that's why he's recommending medical marijuana. I've been meeting with her, I met with her for like 2 years or so. So she did not have PTSD. This MAT provider is like, the clinic looks like a dispensary. When you go in, there is, that's what he's selling, that's what he's promoting. And that's where people get buprenorphine. Yeah.
And just like an interesting note, that particular physician was like, when the opioid epidemic, like as it became something that we were really paying a lot of attention to, this particular physician was used as like an expert in Pennsylvania on MAT.
Cool.
I think from like a harm reduction model, it's really helpful. Obviously, like you've said a million times, Kim, like I would much rather have a loved one who has, like a cannabis dependency rather than an opiate dependency. But I think it's really easy for people to think it's like the forever, treatment, and that it's not like how methadone and Suboxone and all of those were intended, which is just to help you move through the dependence and not be on it forever. So I think people equate them as, I'm just going to be on this forever. I don't have to do the work. But if we can, try to change that picture and have people realize that, like, it's not for long-term use, it's to help with the short-term, the acute, that it could be beneficial. But I don't see people, like when people come in with opiate dependency and they're looking for medical marijuana cards, that's not the mindset that they come in with, not from my experience anyway.
Something I just found out, Kim, I think is very interesting. It may be a sign of things to come. The NFL has recently come out and announced that they will no longer screen players for marijuana. So I guess that's their way of saying, well, we're not going to endorse this, but since you guys get the crap beat out of you in every game you play, we're going to look the other way.
And to some degree, that for chronic pain, and I'm sure many of these individuals have chronic pain.
Oh, for sure.
There's research to support the use of cannabis in that context. And so when you abuse your body for a living, it makes sense. Now, the long-term neurological effects, I think, bear mentioning, coupled with significant and repeated head traumas. I'm sure that hopefully more research will come out in that particular area. But yeah, I also saw that the NBA is exploring going that direction as well.
The NHL is as well. Almost every major sports league, say maybe baseball, is moving away from policing.
Baseball players just use cocaine anyway, John.
I mean,
and PEDs.
Yeah. But it makes sense in the grand scheme of, like you said, the research is there for that aspect of it. I think, and I mentioned this in my group, CBD oil is becoming like holy water that we sprinkle on every issue that comes up. And we need to know more before we do that. I'd never heard anything about the liver issues that you brought up, but that's very concerning. I mean, we already talked about how alcohol and other things can affect a person's liver. You know, are we thinking about that?
Yeah, specifically the research was suggesting an increase in fatty liver, which is a precursor to cirrhosis. And they were seeing it in adolescents. That's also a very important part of that. It wasn't just like in older adults that made also probably choices to eat a bunch of McDonald's and everything else, but they were seeing that symptom in younger kiddos. I think it was specific to the autism community, actually. I'll try to find the exact study because I'm sure there are folks on here. I was in one of the breakout rooms while Victoria was talking about her snake oil training. So I'll try to find that exact point of literature and send it on. Any other experiences with medical cannabis for opiate use disorders or PTSD? Has anybody else noticed trends within your individual practice? Okay, and we will keep going. And we are going to switch to, all right, I apologize in advance to my BCBAs for this video. You're not going to like it.
You kind of grieve the child that you thought you would have?
No.
College and high school.
Stop. I need to get
girlfriend.
right. Stop it.
Kids, stuff like that. And now I actually have hope, you know.
A Broken Arrow mother tells Two Works for You that medical marijuana is working miracles for her son with autism. She says before it was legal here in Oklahoma, they tried everything, and she'd almost given up hope that anything would work. Well, Two Works for You's Erin Conrad sits down with her only on Two. 6-year-old Ian McAdams is all smiles. This happy-go-lucky demeanor relatively new. Mom Melody McAdams started treating Ian with medical marijuana friction oil, also known as tincture oil, just 2 months ago.
I noticed a change overnight almost. He slept through the night. The meltdowns have completely stopped. See how happy he is? And he doesn't have a device. Like, that makes me happy.
These changes in Ian, life-changing for the mom who says she'd almost run out of hope.
And we did the ABA. We did that for 3.5 years, which cost us almost $900 a month copay. And we also did lots of speech therapy and lots of occupational therapy. And it just got exhausting. And he wasn't really changing.
She says the deciding factor in Ian's new treatment was a trip to the doctor, where she asked about options for medication.
And he told me no Seroquel. And I was like, I'm not putting him on an antipsychotic. He's not psychotic. If you look up the side effects of Seroquel, which was what was recommended to Ian, versus the side effects of this, you would choose it for your child too.
The family's quality of life has now made leaps and bounds, the first time since Ian was diagnosed.
We wouldn't have the blinds up. We wouldn't have glass up. We wouldn't have the things unplugged, the resets. You know, we'd have everything child safety like a baby. He's not like a baby anymore.
Moments like this,
Ian?
a victory every time.
Yes, you're beautiful. Come on, out of the camera, please. Thank you. He communicates with me every day. Yesterday, he told me he had a bad day at school.
Sherilyn Walton is with TARC, a Tulsa area advocacy group for Oklahomans with developmental and intellectual disabilities. She says since medical marijuana became legal here, some parents have looked into the treatment. But she says there haven't been a lot of studies on the effects of medical marijuana on children with autism.
So we are cautioning families about what they read and what they do to make some really wise choices and not do anything without the help of a physician.
She says she supports medical marijuana, but doesn't feel comfortable recommending it just yet.
It may be that it works with some, that marijuana might work with some and not with others, just like other medications. We will certainly continue to watch the research. We want to give out good information, and we wanted information that we feel like we can trust.
But for Melody, she says so far, this is the best choice for her child.
3, swallow, swallow, swallow. Good job.
She says as long as he's happy and healthy, she'll keep using it.
He's been in public school now, and he is excelling. He can write his first name. He can count, and I believe he'll have a job and be able to live somewhat normally, which is beyond exciting. Yeah, all you want as a parent, for sure, is your kid to be happy and to have a fulfilling life. Yeah.
Erin Conrad, 2 Works for You.
Now, the medical marijuana industry shows no signs of slowing down in Oklahoma. In April alone, sales topped $18 million. That's $6 million more than in March. The Oklahoma Medical Marijuana Authority says that they have approved more than 104,000 patient licenses since the law took effect.
So thoughts on that?
It sounds too good to be true.
I found it a very sad video. It might not be a surprise to most on this call, but I grew up with a brother with both Down syndrome and autism. So we grew up with TSSs within our home and MTBSCs and physical therapists and occupational therapists and music therapists and therapeutic riding facilities and all kinds of different things. And inherent in all of that, medical marijuana was never suggested to us. But I also know like the desperation of a parent, and I know what that looks like. I know what that feels like. And now having my own kiddos and sort of navigating some struggles, especially with my youngest, I understand and find her experience very relatable. And I don't know that she's getting what she believes she's getting. And to go from my child was very severely disabled to like, look at this miracle drug. It just really kind of reeks of like some of the anti-vax literature and some of the other things that it just feels so in such stark contrast. And not saying that's not possible, but the research really doesn't support it yet, so it's concerning. Other thoughts or reactions to that particular experience?
I feel like that's representative of what's going to be happening, though. If you think about what this woman's been through, and you think about what people in her boat go through as they look for solutions to what they're experiencing, I'm not surprised that would be something that would become an option for her, and that much like, I don't know if it's a placebo or if it actually was that way, but you do something different and you see something and you make the association that, well, this is because of this, when it may be that you were looking hard enough that you found something. So I understand what you're saying about, it's kind of sad that she would go that route or would feel that way, but I think that what she may be seeing that may not be there, maybe just, this is the latest hope. Mm-hmm. And I hope that her son continues to have the gains that she believes he's having. And, maybe in time, there'll be better options for her. But at least for her sake, it seems like she's got hope back that maybe she had lost.
I feel like a lot of people who do kind of see marijuana as the miracle drug would look at videos like that and see almost like a confirmatory bias. Like, see, like, look what it did for this kid, when for that particular kid, it may have had a real neurological benefit, but we don't know because the research isn't there. So even if there was, stop. Sorry, that's my kid yelling at me for talking. But I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that even if there was a real neurological benefit for that little boy, we have no idea why. We have no idea what it did for his brain because his brain was never neurotypical to begin with. And I feel like that's part of that nuance that really needs to be highlighted just as much as this stark contrast in this little boy's functioning.
I think it like also made me feel a little uncomfortable because I feel like children and individuals with disabilities, like they are vulnerable populations. So I feel like since there's not enough research, I feel like they should not be given these things because we should never try to like see if anything works like drug wise on a vulnerable population. So like that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable as well.
Yeah, there are certainly some ethical concerns when it comes to drug trials for any vulnerable population. So whether it be women that are pregnant or nursing or incarcerated populations, I mean, there certainly is a number of sort of like legal and ethical components with probably our biggest concern at present being very much tied to the impact of marijuana on the developing brain and sort of, as I mentioned previously, that lack of myelination or that delay in the myelination process and how that has a tendency to slow down cognitive processing long term. And especially if it's something that's not just given for a distinct not just if it's given to somebody for a distinct period of time, but something that's given for a long period of development, you're missing out on certain like zones or like windows of development. And so there are some concerns, again, for the impact. We previously talked about anxiety and PTSD, and we are also seeing a lot of families kind of advocate for that as well. I know that like in raising my kids, I participate in different like Facebook groups or social media group, like mommy groups. And with the advent of COVID-19, I saw a marked increase of moms saying like, my 7-year-old's really distressed or my 10-year-old's really anxious. And I've been thinking about getting them a medical marijuana card. And from but I don't necessarily blame the parents for that, but I blame sort of the story that is being sold and the narrative with the strong lack of evidence. And so I get it. I understand, like as a mother, when my kid is hurting, my heart is breaking and I'm willing to do anything to help them. I think the problem comes in when we are saying that this thing helps and really we don't have the evidence to support it. It makes me think a lot about like in the early 80s and early 90s, the huge overprescription of Ritalin for ADHD and other diagnoses, and sort of recognizing long term the impact that has had on the developing brain. And we just don't have the longitudinal studies to explore the efficacy. Anything else before we keep rocking?
Something that came to mind for me was wondering like how easy is it to access this, because I know just depending on where you live, being able to get other types of resources can be so difficult. Like they might make you jump through all these hoops just to get it, or you might not even have access to it if you don't stay in a state that really is prioritizing helping people with developmental disabilities.
It is way easier to get medical marijuana than it is to get IBHS services. It's kind of like there's no website devoted to step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. This is what you do if you think your kid has an autism diagnosis. But if you want medical marijuana, it's very clearly delineated with links and websites. And don't forget to connect your PayPal account.
That's so true. I know when I was working as a BSc and even in private practice, I saw a lot of families or even inpatient that, you know, it was taking so long for the services to start with IBHS, formerly BHRS. But yeah, that was a common complaint. It's stressful. Like I can only imagine like how it feels on a parent to, you know, have the services get pushed back, and like some parents were waiting like a year. But also something else that I wanted to say, and you can like maybe update me on the more up-to-date research, but I remember when I was in college, oh gosh, like 8 years ago, I had read a research article that stated that there was like a longitudinal study of where they followed adolescents who used marijuana up till they were like, you know, more in their adulthood, late adulthood, and there was a stronger correlation between symptoms of schizophrenia and more psychotic disorders. So I don't know, is that still effective, or have you heard of that?
Yes, I think I have a slide coming up soon looking at psychotic disorders and marijuana use, and there is an association between the two. When you read the literature, it's hard to say if it's that causal association or if it's correlative. So basically, I'm 15 years old, I'm experiencing prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia. It's causing me distress. I choose to self-medicate with marijuana. Later, I develop schizophrenia. Versus marijuana, I'm a neurotypical 15-year-old. I smoke weed because my friends are, and I develop schizophrenia. We have not been able to sort of split apart those two truths, and it's because almost all of our marijuana literature, almost all of it, the primary problem with it is there's a selection bias. So we don't say, you smoke weed, you take a placebo, let's see what happens. We go in and we say, oh, you're smoking weed? Okay, let's now measure that. But those people have already opted into that. And so there's so many other factors that could be contributing. Like there is, like, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but there's a high overlap between ADHD symptoms in childhood and adolescence and maternal marijuana use. Especially in certain countries that actually prescribe marijuana for things like morning sickness. And so there's that high percentage of overlap, but then when you really read the methods section of that particular literature, the thing that shows up overwhelmingly is that many of these women opted in to choosing to smoke marijuana. And we know that many individuals with ADHD-like symptoms may choose to medicate with marijuana. So if mom is more likely to have ADHD, thereby leading to her having a greater likelihood of choosing to smoke weed, the child is more likely to also have ADHD just from the sheer basis of biology. So what impact does marijuana have on that? We just don't know. Anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something along the lines of the training I do here at PCS in terms of like fads for autism treatment. And I was telling this to my breakout group, but when I created the training, I didn't even have cannabis in it. And so like over the years, it's become such a hot issue that I felt the need to add it. And I think we often spend a lot more time in the training talking about that than some of the other even like more egregious options out there. But we do spend a long time, and it's a big part of the training, to actually explore like why parents of kids with autism in particular feel so desperate. So it's not to criticize or to point fingers at, like, you know, some of us are thinking, how could someone do this? We don't know anything about it. I thought it was interesting. The mom said, well, I would never give him Seroquel. When actually, objectively, we know a lot more about Seroquel. Maybe not for kids with autism, or maybe not that it's effective or ineffective, but I just thought that was like very interesting that she said she'd never give him that, but she would give him this thing that there's, you know, not been any research on yet. And yeah, it's something we explore. It's something that's coming up. We've had several families within VHRS who have tried various things. And I wasn't upset at the video. The one I actually show, I can't remember the group. that puts it, but I think it's absolutely heart-wrenching to watch, you know, and then it's this cute little boy. I can send you the link for it later, but it's a super cute little boy, and, you know, same type of deal. He wasn't talking, now he does X, Y, and Z. And we, you know, we also talk about different biases and how that could be happening, but that's what's out there. And she did mention, like, we tried ABA, and the plain truth is, like, ABA is hard. It's work you do every day versus, she said, it's like overnight that she saw the difference. That's what most people are after, and that's what most people want to see. So the nature of behavior change is slow, and that's undesirable. But when you have all of these other things promising quick results, immediate results that are stress and challenge free to the individual, that's
proper.
That's not just ABA, that's all the other treatment you guys are trying to do. How can we compete with it? That's the challenge we face every day.
That's a very valid point, and one that I often make in my addictions work with my clients, because I'm here trying to teach you, like, deep breathing techniques and grounding techniques and strategies of connection. And I'm talking to you about going to NA meetings and utilizing your church supports and familial supports. And they're like, but, like, 30 seconds and a needle and I'll be fine. You know, like, we are up against, like, a true light switch of pain. And we're like, have you tried mindfulness meditation? And, like, just one-to-one, what we're selling is not near as effective as what they have in the short term. And
Yeah,
so that's when we really zoom out and look at the long-term impact. Someone
That
start to
become
talk.
a part of the sales pitch for me. What I say is up front, nothing works as fast. Nothing works as fast. But with it working as fast as it does, you have to continually do it in a way that puts you at greater and greater risk each time you do it. So for that trade-off, let's work on this, which, yes, it won't work as fast, but you won't be potentially putting yourself in danger and risk with each successive use of it.
I use the exact same sort of, it won't be as effective, but no one's ever died from deep breathing. Like, it's just not, there's no, like, overdose resulting in death of too much breathing.
Well, you know, for me, Kim, it all goes back to the mentality. I mean, humans, and addicts in particular, love instant gratification. What we do
And that's not an addictive thing. I love instant gratification. I go to the gym once.
Yeah.
Why do I not look different?
Nothing better than a pint of Ben and Jerry's, right? But what we do is really not about instant gratification. So it's, you know, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, make me better right now.
It's tough to compete with.
I did some research on this. Now, granted, I've never worked with autism and I've never known any autistic children. So I'm not coming from that background. But when I did some research on this for a class in school, what I found, and this was several years ago, was that all the stuff that I read said that healthy adolescents that used marijuana, they tended to have long-term cognitive issues, lower intelligence, lowered ability to problem solve, and serious emotional dysregulation because they didn't know how to name or cope with emotions at all because they never felt them. So there was a lot of long-term effects for that. Now, if you consider, like, small children and adolescents and the little periods of synaptic pruning that go on, plus the decreased myelinization, plus they're already set up with cognitive problems, long term, it kind of makes me like, ugh. But then on the other hand, if I were that parent in the video and I knew nothing at all about the development of a brain, and I had a child who had behavioral problems and someone gave me a drop of marijuana juice that made him wake up happy and play like a normal child the next day, I'd probably feel the same way.
It's tough. It's tough. And I think the law in the state, so the fact that it's legal for autism, like the sheer fact that that's a certified disorder, I think leads people to believe, well, then it must be safe. They certainly, never in the history of the universe has money ever dictated legislation, right? Never. That doesn't happen. That's not real. I mean, and so those of us who might be a bit more jaded about our systems in general, but the medical marijuana industry makes tremendous donations to legislators. And there's a lot of advocacy in that particular area because there's a large dollar amount associated with it. And I think I heard somebody in one of the groups sort of talk about is that and where the reaction came from the 17th Street community, that's 17th Street's right in the heart of Allison Hill. That's where we have one of our clinics. It has a tendency to be a lower income, very diverse community. And you see these two white guys that are making a whole lot of money off of this particular industry. And it's not too hard to make some other assumptions about that as well. So I think it really bears a larger discussion, and that larger nuanced discussion. Again, opiates, really bad almost 100% of the time. Marijuana can have some positive, negative, but so do cheeseburgers. You know what I mean? I think it's really important for us to have this more nuanced discussion and look at where the money is going and looking at the cost to different communities if they are to really pursue this this methodology. And many of our clients just aren't hearing it. They're not at a place where they're willing to kind of zoom out and look at it from that bigger picture. But I will say that the only time I've ever gotten clients to really hear me on that is when I've taken that line of discussion. So say, well, you know what? I'd like you to go look up who owns your dispensary, and then research their net worth, and then look at look at those different pieces and their political contributions and things like that, to really challenge people to consider that maybe this green card that they decided to bring into treatment and throw on your desk like it's a mic drop bears a little bit further exploration. And at the end of the day, I freaking love my clients. I love them as clinically appropriate as one can, but I love them fiercely. When they hurt, I hurt, and I care about them, and I care about their well-being. And so for them to show up, I would feel the same way as if they showed up and said, hey, I'm going to start taking 6 benzos a day because I just think that's a good idea, and I've been given this prescription and it's going to work. And it will work. That's the problem. It's going to work, and it's going to harm you. And so that's the frustrating piece in this. To date, there is limited research and no evidence on the potential short-term, long-term, or neurodevelopmental risks or benefits of medical marijuana as it's related to autism spectrum disorder. So there's nothing. But it's an approved use in the state of Pennsylvania, and parents are now giving it to their children.
Kim, could you find any articles, even if they were subjective studies?
No.
I found one.
Yeah, I found none.
The aberrant behavior checklist was the dependent measure. That's it. That's all I could find.
Nope, I found 0. This is actually from like the Society of Autism Research. And then in preparing for this, Autism Speaks, which is another organization that sort of would be worth researching a bit. The Autism Speaks organization has recently come out in favor of medical marijuana for autism use disorders. And if you dig into like the financials behind autism, it used to be an organization that I believed in very much. And when you start to sort of dig into and research that organization, it is probably not the best. But they do have, and it was just released like this year, I think it was April when I found April, May. It was very recent. But yeah, they are now promoting the use of medical marijuana for autism spectrum disorders.
I'm not surprised.
Yes, I'm not surprised either. I'd be interested to see their financials from this quarter and how that correlates.
I think the problem with Autism Speaks and how questionable they are too is that like they are the most well-known like organization with involved with autism, and people generally trust what they say.
Yep. They are very well, I mean, probably the most famous. And then the Autism Science Foundation, their statement basically is that we agree with the American Academy of Pediatrics and that we really need further study on the safety and efficacy of medical marijuana and other disorders and conditions of childhood. So there are definitely a number of concerns in that particular content area. Additional research, so medical marijuana during pregnancy can result in a number of problematic outcomes for the unborn babe, including THC passing through the placenta and onto the child. So this can pass through that barrier. Problems include, but are not limited to, low birth weight, prematurity, ADHD, and learning disabilities. Now, it's important to mention that those exact same conditions are also associated with maternal nicotine use or cigarette smoking. And there is some research to kind of draw those correlates between lung health. However, especially in the area of edibles, one of the things or one of the concerns that came up when I was researching this particular content area is that edibles have such a it's so difficult to sort of regulate dosage when making edibles, especially those who aren't purchasing them from like a legit dispensary, but you're just baking brownies in your dorm room. It's real difficult to regulate the amount of THC in each dose and might even vary within a substance. So I bake 20 pot cookies. This one has 15 milligrams in it, and this one has 4. It doesn't like mix as well. And so there are some concerns that, especially in the area of edibles, individuals are consuming more and more. And that was sort of the concern associated with women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. So the current medical suggestion, that is, if you are pregnant or breastfeeding, you should stop your marijuana use immediately, continuing to breastfeed while making every effort to reduce the amount of marijuana regardless of the form in which you consume your marijuana. You really want to protect your kids from secondhand marijuana smoke, whether in the home or the car. It is now, by the way, illegal in the state of Pennsylvania to smoke in your car while your children are in the car. So that has now been made illegal. But I know I shouldn't have to say this, but I think we have to say this. Like if you're smoking weed at home, you can't do it with your kids in the room. Don't operate your vehicle with or without your child. Safely store marijuana out of reach of both children and pets, and have it. It's interesting. Obviously, Nirvana was necessary. I mean, it's fitting, right? Have a sober, unimpaired child care provider take care of your kids while you are impaired on the substance of marijuana. Any questions about what we have discussed so far? So kiddos and right now marijuana advocates are heavily advocating for ADHD to be added to the list of approved treatments. Heavily. So that is sort of bears the suggestion that who's most likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, and one of actually the diagnostic criteria is that symptoms must be present before 18 years of age. So children are far more likely to receive an ADHD diagnosis, and therefore this will likely be another diagnosis that sort of leads to some controversy within the treatment field.
Kim, I have a real quick question. Yeah. The slides that you're showing aren't in what was sent to us today.
Oh, okay. I probably sent the old version.
Because I actually need this for a specific client. If you could update.
Yeah. I can. I'll send the updated slides out. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
I will say that when you get your medical card, let me just disclaimer. My mom had cancer, and so I was her caregiver. So I had to go through the whole process of getting my card. But when you do that, if you're like of age to bear children, they basically, you have to agree that if you have children, if you become pregnant, that you'll stop your marijuana use. Like, not that they can really enforce that, but like it's in there as far as like if you're trying to get your medical card and you're still able to bear children, they talk to you briefly about like some of the risks associated with that, and it is technically not legal in Pennsylvania to still have your medical card and use and be pregnant. So
and it is important to say that the way they regulate that is that they can test your baby at delivery, and you could lose your baby to the CYS system should that baby test positive. So while they won't, like, if you're on 12th Street smoking a joint 9 months pregnant, they probably won't take you into custody at that point in time. But when you deliver and they test the baby, should the baby test positive, the baby could be removed from your care.
That brings up a question that I have. It's a little off topic, but a little on topic. Is marijuana the only drug that you can be under the influence of and have another caregiver supervising your child that's sober? Or like, what are the laws as far as, because I know, like, you know, like if you were, and just hypothetically, like if you had a family that has like a meth lab, I remember one of the trainings that we're supposed to report that. But like, as far as meth and like marijuana, what else for the other drugs? Like, I mean, if you know someone has syringes around their children, like, should we report that? Like, what?
It's very nuanced. So a meth lab, so if I am cooking meth with my 2 and 4-year-old at home, that is directly reportable because of the danger associated with cooking meth. However, if put my 2 and 4-year-old to bed, came down here to my basement and smoked meth, that is not reportable. So if I'm not using it within the presence of my child, it is not considered reportable. So even if there's no other caregiver here physically, there's nobody else here. If my children are technically not at acute safety risk. And thereby it's not reportable. Now, if I'm leaving even like a vape pen or a syringe or whatever, if I'm leaving it on my kitchen table and my 4-year-old can walk by and grab it, that is reportable. So it all has to do with access. It is technically not even reportable to be high around your children. So in theory, I could put on Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, leave, go outside, smoke a blunt, come back inside. That's technically not reportable unless I engage in another behavior, which would be reportable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like what kind of behavior hypothetically are you kind of talking about? Like, what'd you say?
If I slap my kid, beat my kids, or or engaging in neglect behaviors. So if I'm so high that I forget to feed my kids for 17 hours, that would be reportable. Gotcha. But it all has to do with acute harm.
Okay.
What if the kids are older, like adolescent, and they know that their parents or caregivers are doing that, and they've talked about it? Would that be reportable then, because they are voicing that like they know, but their parents aren't like acknowledging it or denying it?
That's when it gets really muddy, right? So at that point in time, it has to do with perceived psychological distress.
Okay.
So if a kid comes in and says, yeah, my mom's a stoner, not reportable. If a kid is coming in like, my mom's gonna die, like if it's causing like this long-term chronic psychological impact, it counts.
Okay.
And so a lot of that really has to do with, like if you log into the child abuse reporting website, that the .gov site, it will ask questions about like psychological impact and perceived long-term impact and things like that. And that's the difference maker. Okay. So if they just know that their parents use drugs, or even if they know that their parents are acutely intoxicated, it's not necessarily reportable. Then you zoom out and you look at the impact.
I had something similar to that happen in where I work. We do Celebrate Recovery, but I work with babies on Sundays, and there was a young mother who had a 4 to 5 month old baby, and she would come in laughing and making jokes because she said that her and her husband smoked that much marijuana around the house that she never had a problem getting her baby to take a nap because he just fell asleep and slept all day. So that we reported.
Yes, that right there, that's reportable. Like the child shouldn't be exposed to secondhand smoke. The child shouldn't have access to any of the substances. The child, something like a meth lab, or even something like dealing out of the home where there's high risk behaviors going on and the child is at risk that way would be considered reportable. It's very, very nuanced. Now, I do think it's really important. This is a good time to emphasize that you can report just about anything in good faith and not receive consequences. So the law in the state of Pennsylvania really does protect the reporter, that as long as it is you're reporting in an effort to protect the kiddo or the client, you legally can with very few possibility of legal repercussions. But I would still encourage you, talk to your clinical supervisor, talk to your team leader. That's something that you should really explore because there is the possibility of the therapeutic rupture in that particular situation. So then there is sort of that, while you cannot be, or it's unlikely that you would ever receive legal consequences for reporting when you shouldn't have, there could be very tangible relational consequences with your client that might lead them to prematurely leave treatment or, fill in the blank, whatever else. So for those reasons, I think it's really important to be mindful of any reports being sort of within the realm of legality. Anything else before we move on? Gosh, our time is almost up here today. I think I have enough time to get through everything, but if I don't, when considering marijuana for the treatment of anxiety disorders, it should be remembered that regular marijuana use will result in tolerance, thus increasing the risk of what they call rebound anxiety upon cessation and fostering that sense of cannabis dependence. The mechanism is very similar to that of benzodiazepines. And to date, there have been no reported randomized controlled trials to show sustained benefits of cannabis for the treatment of anxiety disorders. There's no supported use, no current support for the use with ADHD, although as I've mentioned previously, that's being very heavily advocated for from that perspective. I do imagine that will kind of drop off should that legislation work its way through the Senate to legalize cannabis as a whole. So I think if we do legalize it for recreational, we're going to see a shift in the way that we talk about cannabis for medicinal. Cannabis can also, a fairly common negative side effect of cannabis is a mania or manic-like symptoms, including fantasies of power or perceptions of having arrived at this brilliant insight. Some other things that have a tendency to be associated with this can be overspending and hypersexuality. So acute cannabis intoxication might lead to somebody maybe spending $7,000 on Amazon Prime, or engage, or COVID-19 did that for us, but spending all this money on Amazon, or engaging with multiple sexual partners that you otherwise perhaps wouldn't have been sexually interested in. But there is a small subset of the population that display true mania or manic-like symptoms. And there's no evidence to support its use in personality disorders. So when it comes to psychotic disorders, which I believe somebody already asked about, but cannabis use is associated with more severe psychotic symptoms, so that individuals who have a psychotic disorder that then go on to utilize cannabis often have an increase in severity of those symptoms. And then you can see with a statistically significant reduction in those symptoms when they discontinue marijuana use. So if I have a psychotic disorder and I start smoking weed, you're going to see an increase in my symptomology. You also see those symptoms drop right back off again when I stop smoking. CBD plus an antipsychotic does have some promising impact on reducing positive symptoms of psychosis, but again, due to the lack of regulation surrounding CBD oil, this is pretty difficult to study. There have been 2 cannabis-based medications that were recommended for the treatment of psychotic disorders, but neither showed any true promising impact, and both were eventually removed from the market due to negative side effects. They were called Rimonabant and Drindabant, and neither are still in circulation today. As you have figured out, I have previously added, or I had added for this presentation, more on the area of autism use disorders. But again, I reiterate that there's very limited research, and research shows an overall negative impact on the developing brain, as well as long-term health barriers associated with long-term behaviors of smoking or vaping a substance. Youth are much more likely to obtain through the black market because they can't legally obtain through a medical marijuana dispensary. And those individuals, obviously, there's no regulation there, so they're just buying weed from a friend. The other thing that we're seeing is a bunch of kids that think that they are little mini Walter Whites and trying to create their own not marijuana, but trying to create their own synthetic marijuana. And we have had, at least in Lebanon County, a number of adolescent overdoses resulting in death tied to that behavior, because kids go on the internet, they research, they find a bunch of stuff in their teen cabinets and wherever else they're finding it. And then from there, trying to go on to say that they've made synthetic weed, selling it to friends, and then being charged with murder. So I think it's really, really important that we have these broader, more nuanced discussions with kids. And I think that synthetic marijuana, like even that language, can be really dangerous and misleading, because synthetic marijuana literally has nothing to do with marijuana. Like, it's not tied to the plant. It's not a derivative of a marijuana plant. It is a mixture of chemicals that has a marijuana-like effect, and therefore we've called it synthetic marijuana. It's also much less likely to show up on drug tests because they're constantly and chronically changing the chemical composition. So that has a number of, obviously, legal ramifications as well, as you seek to kind of reduce that use. Any questions about marijuana use or statements about marijuana use among kids and adolescents? So generally speaking, there's a fundamental mismatch between the state level legalizations of medical marijuana and physicians being trained in the prescription of it. So this was rolled out very much at a legislative level, with the medical community kind of lagging behind. And as we've reviewed much of today, the medical community really hasn't been able to fully catch up at this point in time. With more and more states on the cusp of legalizing medical marijuana, physician training should adapt to encompass this new reality of medical practice. But when you think about the process of becoming a medical physician, about becoming a doctor or a prescriber, you're in med school for what, 4 years, and then you have some sort of internship and postdoc and things like that. So they need to really build this in on the front end so that physicians can get adequate training. Right now, most of the training is done through webinars or other CEUs, very similar to what I'm doing with you all here today, in an effort to kind of catch up with the field. But a number of physicians have really lamented the process, saying, like, we weren't ready for this, no one was trained in this, and then all of a sudden it was legal and everybody wanted it. So the medical community is kind of following on the tail end to try to figure out or sort out what can be done or how we can respond to this safely. When it comes to driving and cannabis, the research is not excellent. So one of the pieces of research is that individuals often really fail to recognize their level of impact. So they may be high on marijuana, but they're going to rate themselves as being less high or having less of a cognitive impact. Very similar research, by the way, in the areas of drinking and driving, that people historically really just kind of suck at predicting their own level of impairment, which can obviously have a number of negative consequences there. But the research on cannabis shows that there is a more significant impact on motor skills, slower reaction time, impairment in short-term memory and concentration, causing drivers to vary speed or to like wander on the road, and reduced ability to make decisions quickly or handle unexpected events. Individuals who have a tendency to utilize marijuana and then get in their car and drive, one of the predominant problems is that they have a tendency to drive slower than other vehicles on the road because they perceive themselves as going faster. So remember, in one of my very early slides, acute marijuana intoxication is associated with an increased perception of stimuli, that you just experience things more fully and more heavily. So individuals who are driving think that they're going faster than they are, or it feels like people are careening out of control, I suppose, and really they're driving much slower. So that can be a risk when it comes to safety. If you see a medical marijuana sign on like a billboard on the highway, usually this group buys the next billboard and puts up this sign. So, and you'll see them all around. There's one on Harrisburg if you're going down 81, or at least there was the last time I was up that way. And it's like, want to get your life back? Use medical marijuana. And then it has this guy like running really fast and like looking super athletic. And then the very next sign is this: don't drive high. And so I think that regardless of the outcome, and there are so many medications that carry that black box warning, right? So anytime somebody is prescribed an opiate for pain, it has that black box warning that says you should not operate a motor vehicle while under the impact of this substance. And the same is true for a number of different medications, and it shouldn't be any different for the marijuana population. So I think, yeah, this is my last big slide. So the last thing that really bears discussion is that it's extremely difficult to get accurate levels of marijuana in the bloodstream and sort of get that understanding without actually taking an IV drug blood draw to measure for acute intoxication. And if I get pulled over going down 81, probably the period of time between when I get pulled over and when they're actually drawing my blood is at least 2, but likely more hours than that to get that acute blood draw. So one of the reasons that state legislators are reluctant to increase or to approve recreational marijuana use has to do with the inability to have accurate field testing. The Potalyzer is what they've called it. It's designed to measure THC present in the saliva because THC is metabolized at that declining rate. So it stays in your system longer, it just stays at a less impactful level. Your highest density of acute marijuana intoxication is approximately 1 minute after smoking. However, there are so many variables, including the strain of substance that you're utilizing, the method of ingestion, the rate of ingestion, and then a number of other personal physical factors. So if you're smoking or vaping, approximately 1 minute after ingestion is where you're going to see this highest impact. However, what we know is that if individuals are ingesting marijuana through a different means, perhaps it's through an edible, sometimes the latency there is significantly longer. Some of the research suggesting anywhere from about 45 minutes to an hour to experience the full effect. That's dangerous on a couple of different levels. The first is individuals who aren't savvy or aren't aware of that might ingest pot, wait 20 minutes, be like, I feel fine. I can drive. And then they're driving down the highway and all of a sudden it's metabolizing more accurately. And now they're operating from a level of impairment that they didn't anticipate. And they're at a higher risk for safety. Another issue often associated with ingestion, especially through edibles, is that individuals, again, consume the substance, wait, think like, oh, I'm fine, consume more of the substance, wait, nothing's happening, consume more of the substance, and then just whatever they consumed all comes to a head when it reaches up and slaps them right in the face, and then they recognize that they're now high out of their minds and unable to function. The good news is overdose from marijuana is extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely. So the most common thing is very similar to that audio clip of the police officer who ate the pot brownies, is thinking that they're going to die, having a panic attack, sometimes nausea or vomiting. There is also a new, let me make sure I have the right language for it. It's hypermesis, cannabis hypermesis. I think I want to make sure I say that correctly. Cannabinoid hypermesis syndrome is something that we're seeing actually more and more, especially in an outpatient setting. That particular disorder can be associated with a number of things, including kidney failure and electrolyte problems, and there have been deaths associated with that. However, cannabinoid hypermesis is tied to long-term, daily, and regular use of cannabis. And as it builds up in one system, it's characterized by nausea, vomiting, and extreme chills. Another uncommon side effect of this, but can happen, is second and third degree burns from really, really, really hot water. So these individuals go and take extremely hot showers because they're so cold, and then they burn the bejesus out of themselves when they do it. We've had actually a couple instances of this occur here at PCS. I can think of one of our clinicians in Lancaster had a client that was coming in and just saying, like, I've just got the flu and I can't get rid of it. I'm having nausea, I'm vomiting. And the problem is the individuals in these situations are thinking nausea, vomiting, well, THC helps with that. So they smoke more weed. And then the more they smoke, the sicker they get, because it increases their nausea and vomiting. So then they're like, well, obviously I just need more THC. But it's sort of that cyclical problem in that they end up consuming far more THC than is safe, and find themselves with that electrolyte imbalance because they can't keep any of their food or water down. But that is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. So in our last 15 minutes today, does anyone have any thoughts or questions associated with medical marijuana? Or does anybody have a medical marijuana case that they would wish to staff with the 70 brilliant minds currently available on this call?
I have a question about PCS's policy as it moves forward, because I'm pretty confident you guys are jumping ahead of the curve to figure out what are we going to do when this does become legal.
Like, what are we going to do in terms of policy?
Yeah.
So I think that as a whole, it is what we've landed on is that we will never recommend the use of medical marijuana until the science catches up. And should the science catch up and start providing evidence, I will also change my opinion. We are, as they do seek to legalize it, and I believe, honestly, it'll probably be legal in the state of Pennsylvania for recreational use pretty soon. I thought the 2020 election, I actually thought that they were going to get it on the ballot. We have a Democratic governor. I thought he was going to push that through to be on the ballot in an effort to turn out voters. It doesn't appear as though that's going to happen during 2020, but I had read some articles suggesting that might be possible. But I'm pretty certain, if not 2020, probably the 2022 midterm elections, we're going to see something like that. We are going to treat it again like we do anything else, which is on the basis of therapy interfering behaviors. So if clinically the use has a tendency to interact negatively with the with our clinical objectives, then we're going to address it on that basis. And with anything else, to talk to our clients about it, the negative impact of marijuana on therapeutic progress. So therapy doesn't work because of the 45 minutes we spend within the room with a client. Therapy works because of the time in between the sessions and like the way they process our interactions and the way they process our communication in that moment. And so if I were to come in, have a really meaningful therapy session, and then leave and smoke weed right away, that's going to interfere with my biological process of processing my therapeutic session. So with any of my clients, I kind of when I was at the VA, I had a super biker supervisor, and his motto was always 12 hours from the bottle to the throttle. And so I kind of feel like that's a good rule as well. 12 hours before our session and 12 hours after our session. I don't believe you should use marijuana because I believe that will negatively impact our ability to engage in therapy. But sort of discussing and having those conversations with our clients at that bigger picture place can be really important.
I think the way I see it, I think it would be much easier to deal with if it was just legal across the board, because we can do just what we do with alcohol and say, you know, we expect you to be substance free while you're here. And so that includes alcohol and that includes marijuana. For me, the difficulty becomes when we have that rule, but there's a doctor saying it's okay to use marijuana. So to me, I mean, from my perspective, it would make things so much easier if it was just legal in terms of how we address it in treatment.
I agree.
Yes. I think psychoeducation now, since we're like in this in-between cusp where it's legal for medical use, but it's not recreational yet. And we, I think, have to be the authority in the psychoeducation because we have the training and more information, even though there's just not a lot of information right now to be had, but also from a harm reduction, especially for the drug and alcohol people, like with alcohol and marijuana together, it can actually suppress symptoms of alcohol poisoning, which makes it easier to die of alcohol poisoning if you're drinking heavily and mixing it. I don't know about the interactions for other substances, but I know that interaction, and a lot of people don't know that. And like just from a harm reduction standpoint, that can be really valuable information that might save a life.
When it makes sense, right? You're much less likely, like marijuana treats nausea. If you drink too much and acute alcohol poisoning, one of the biological things that our body does to protect us is to force us to vomit. And if you're suppressing that nausea or vomiting artificially, makes a lot of sense, right? Other thoughts or reactions, or does anyone have a case they wish to discuss? Has anyone else encountered the cannabinoid hyperemesis? I've now heard of 2 cases within PCS where individuals had clients that suffered from that disorder. Anybody else encounter that yet? Does anyone have suggestions on strategies in educating our clients in ways to kind of approach them, one, from that non-judgmental stance, but with the information that they might need to make their best long-term decision?
I think if we talk to people about function, we might get a little bit more of a conversation going. Because when we don't talk about function, we simply say don't do stuff, then naturally the reaction is, oh, well, I'm grown, I can do what I want to do, which is fair. But if you talk about function, okay, what are you using the substance for? What are you hoping to be the outcome here? Is there any other possible route to get to that outcome that doesn't potentially put you in harm's way? You tend to get a little bit less resistance if you go that route. So I'm not sure if other people take that approach or if that's even a discussion people are willing to entertain. But you know, if you say the sky is falling, people are eventually going to ignore you. But if you point out that, hey, that cloud's a lot closer than it was a moment ago, and it seems like it may have something in it, maybe, just maybe, the head goes up. Maybe.
I almost sort of think of it too. Sometimes I even sort of pull the background that I've had in with working in like the BHRS side of things and the behavioral interventions of things. And so, you know, when we're talking there, the language isn't you need to stop doing something, like Johnny was saying, don't tell people to stop doing something, but rather the language is, what do we want you to do? What do we want to replace with? And I think kind of same thing here, to sit here and tell someone just to stop smoking or stop drinking or any of that, like, we have to be willing to have that conversation of what are we replacing this with? What's going to be something that's positive for you? You know, like we said before, you got to be willing to try some of the behavioral strategies that are, you know, longer term. It takes the effort to use, but longer term is more beneficial for you. But if we talk in the language of like the positive and replacing versus like, don't do this because it'll get you in trouble. You know, obviously we have to acknowledge the consequences, but people tend to ignore when you just tell them like, no, don't.
And I think we have to acknowledge the perceived benefits in many ways. Like that woman's story, that news article with that woman, or that news story with that woman and her kiddo with autism. I mean, I've worked with families that have had autism disorder, that have kiddos on the autism spectrum, willing to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket for like chiropractic services and some other things that haven't necessarily been empirically validated. So like on the grand scheme of things, like to recognize the mechanism behind it, and then also recognize some of the perceived benefit. I've worked with veterans that have said, I am terrified unless I'm absolutely blackout drunk. And so like to look at the function of that behavior, it's really, really hard to address and reduce a behavior if you're not looking at sort of holistically and seeing what's getting in the way. Other ways that we can open up that conversation and do it in a manner in which allows us to be heard versus being seen from that other perspective.
There's an exercise I used to do when I was running a intervention group here at PCS, where I would take the whiteboard and write down all of the different reasons that people would come up with on why they're using substances in the past. And then we'd go through each one of them and look, did the substance really accomplish what you were hoping for here? And I wasn't being the judge of that. I was letting them really talk about it. And then I would bring in, sleeping. Well, studies have shown it's not really quality sleep. You might get to sleep, but not get good sleep. And just kind of going through each of those pieces so that it's a bigger discussion of, okay, I get what you're looking for here. That's a valid thing to look for, but is this the way to get it?
Things that I keep in mind, kind of like what everyone's been saying, is this, like what Johnny started about workability, like how's this working for you? I'm a big fan of people, live their own recovery. They need to build their own recovery. I'm absolutely going to have suggestions, or I'm going to encourage them to seek supports and meetings and all, sponsors, all that. And this is an adult, typically it's an adult sitting across from me. And as far as them determining what their recovery looks like. And at that same, point in time, kind of keeping in my mind that that stinking thinking, as far as just that addictive mindset. So like if someone's saying, oh, it's not a problem, or oh, this or that, like I've got like my third eye kind of trying to hear like, okay, what's really going on here? I hear you saying, what's actually, like, as far as, do we have some of this addictive mindset, some quarter cutting, some trying to grandiosity, or like whatever, when someone is talking about it, and just that non-judgmental stance of like, tell me why this works for you. You're telling me this works for you. Let's talk about that. And then motivational interviewing, these are the good things about it, but some of the not so good things about it.
I think I would add to Christina what Johnny had said, is using psychoeducation to help them understand like
like what I do with like a lot of clients who have anxiety, I do a whole, psychoeducation piece and explain to them like the escape behaviors and avoidance, and like how regardless if you're using weed or you're using opiates or whatever, it's all an escape behavior. You're doing it to gain relief, immediate relief, and that's not a long-term resolution. It's short-term, and to actually be treated, you need to put in some work. And saying like walking down the street and you have to have your mom with you. That is an avoidance. That is what you're doing to escape that anxiety. Same thing with you're using marijuana to be able to walk down the street and hang out with your friends, and like showing it that way, so we're not being seen as, oh, we're saying no to drugs. And yes, you're drugs, but like not like our bias. It's just in general, like that is not a behavior that is long term.
And I think that is a conversation that I've had with many of my clients, is that I'm not anti-marijuana. I'm pro science, and when it's legal for recreational purposes, I believe in an adult's legal right to make bad choices. All the time we make bad choices, and as long as you're not getting in a car and driving or causing harm to another human, as an adult, you can be high all day, every day. And in California or Colorado, legally that is your choice. I think that it will have a negative impact in other areas of your life over time. But we can't legislate out, we can't save us from ourselves, I suppose, in that particular area. Like, adults need to have the right to make decisions that are bad for us, and we all do all the time, whether it be smoking cigarettes or eating junk food or watching bad reality television. I mean, we all engage in different things that aren't necessarily taking us closer to our goals, but are in fact taking us further away.
I had a client, this was during the time when Lebanon County Probation came out with their initial proclamation that you guys have 30 days to stop smoking weed if you have a green card, yada, yada, yada. And I had one client that was so upset about it because she insisted that she had tried everything under the sun, but the marijuana was the only thing that would relieve her back pain short of surgery. And she was actually reduced to the point of tears because she was convinced that without medical marijuana, she wouldn't be able to work anymore. So one of the first things that I did at the time, and I doubt she ever followed through with it, was that I began searching legal 0% THC hemp oil as an alternative, because hemp oil has been known to be an anti-inflammatory. So I suggested that she give that a shot. Didn't really know what else to tell her at the time.
I know in Lebanon, their motto is that they gave that 30-day proclamation, but they did have the caveat that if you have legal medical necessity and have a doctor willing to support you, then we will explore that with you. So like on a case-by-case basis, it has been approved primarily for individuals with significant pain disorders and for individuals with seizure disorders. So I know that Lebanon has approved on a case-by-case basis, and they are currently navigating a lawsuit with the ACLU. So that also will likely change things, particularly in Lebanon. I don't know of any other counties that followed suit with Lebanon. I think that was very specific to Lebanon.
Something we've done that, and this is again in context of parents of kids with autism, it could have been, I've never done it with marijuana or cannabis treatment in particular, but and part of what I talk about in my training is helping them evaluate it in an objective way. If it's, I mean, I wouldn't be okay with doing it with an actual marijuana, maybe the CBD stuff, depending on administration route. But basically taking data, like a part of our daily responsibility is taking data on behaviors. So if they say, hey, this is supposed to improve their attention to task, okay, we have baseline measures of what their attention is. We look at it for however long. Ideally, they wouldn't even tell us when they're doing it, so we wouldn't know, and we couldn't have placebo effects or let our own biases influence it, and then come back and compare that data to the baseline. I've done it with things like the gluten-free, casein-free diet, and stuff like that, where like then the family was actually pretty receptive to like, hey, we're spending all this extra money, it doesn't really work, so we're going to ditch it, and our lifestyle is easier. But I think you could do some of it with some of it maybe just with some ethical modifications for the cannabis or medical marijuana stuff too.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
And yeah, we have like a whole, basically an ethical decision making from our therapist standpoint of what to do. You know, if there's no change ethically, we have to kind of refer them back to what we know does work. And if we do see a difference, maybe exploring why there could be a difference.
Well, y'all, we have reached the end of this riveting 4-hour training in which I basically told you we know nothing. So I appreciate your patience as we've explored this today. I hope that y'all have a great rest of your week and a wonderful weekend. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
Bye.
Kim.
Thanks, Kim. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.